Okay, I believe we are now live. I apologize to members of the public. I made a mistake and hit the wrong button. So give me 1 second.
Thanks to all who caught it so that we have this important part of our meeting about the accountability framework live streamed to everyone who's watching tonight.
We would never want anyone to miss that.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Hayworth. So I'm going to quickly go back over that timeline, make sure that there are no questions, and then I'm going to go into the details and then talk about the next steps. So without further ado, we'll proceed into the meat of our discussion tonight. To recap our timeline that I know that we have all talked about multiple times, but there may be some members of the public for which this is new. Between March and May, we engaged in stakeholder engagement in thinking through and talking about different changes for the accountability system. We also had a few conversations along the way around some changes for the report card that will be discussed in further detail in our next iteration of stakeholder engagement. We engaged a variety of community groups, parent groups, student groups, educator groups, LEAs, especially our data managers, both internal and external focused working groups. And then we drafted the Essa Amendment and made these revisions that we are presenting to you today. Between June and July, technically June 1st today through July 8th, the Essa Amendment is published and posted for public comment. We are presenting this information today. There will also be another presentation at your July working session to talk about changes that have been made and public comment that has been received to date. And then at your July regular meeting, the final proposed changes will be presented to you for action and approval for the accountability system so that the Essa Amendment can then be further submitted to US Ed for its full approval. Following that, we will engage with LEAs and internal Aussie divisions to make the necessary changes to the accountability framework technical guide that'll be used for the 22-23 school year. That's especially important to our schools and LEAs so that they have a full understanding of the methodology and the business rules for each of the metrics for which they'll be held accountable for during that school year. And we've committed to trying to have that to them as close to the start of the school year as possible. Next slide, please. We know that there's a lot of conversation about what happens next. The Essa Amendment in the accountability system is just one small piece of what the public sees on the DC school report card. And there is a significant amount of interest, rightly so, in the way in which information is presented, the functionality, the design, the language that's used on the DC school report card. And there's a lot of work that's yet to come in that work. The Essa Amendment is the first stage. It's really that core component of the accountability system, but there's so much more to the DC school report card that has to be finalized. So in thinking about those next steps, we've already talked about the technical guide, but thinking about what the next phase of engagement would look like between October and January, there would be additional engagement with stakeholders in the development around the design, the functionality, the display features, how and where things are located, what type of narrative surrounds them and explains some of those metrics. And then we'll be finalizing those design details. As you know, we're designing and building a brand new website, which we're really excited about. And so we'll start building that with our in-house design developers and working feverishly to try and get all of that to the finish line for the release of the brand new accountability scores and metrics, as well as the DC school report card, brand new website in December of 2023. Next slide. I put the slide in here that I know that many of you have seen multiple times, and any of you that have come to any of our stakeholder engagement are familiar with, but I want to make sure that we reiterate that as we embark upon the changes for our accountability system, it was important that we ground ourselves in the foundational principles as well as the design and use principles in that system, recognizing that as we are making change, it's not simply change for change's sake, that we have a lot of federal requirements that our accountability system must align with, but we also have some core foundational principles that were important for us to address and make sure that everyone was understanding what those guidelines were as we were making change. So I'm not going to read these step by step, but I know we've gone over them in detail. Next slide. As we started in this work, when I first presented to you in March, in the beginning of this engagement, I identified 3 priority focus areas for Aussie. The first being that we wanted the changes in our accountability system to improve the equity that was being measured around school performance, both within the metric, between metrics, and then overall. We also wanted to make sure that we were better able to reward growth, whether that meant that we were adding new growth metrics, refining the methodology and the changes in growth metrics, or simply thinking about how we presented that data and calculated that data. We also know that we wanted to continue to strengthen the priority areas of the district, specifically what those gaps were between our historically underserved students, addressing how we measure and can capture the supports and the progress of our students for college and career readiness, the way in which we can align the supports and the resources available for students with disabilities, and then last but not least, the specific emphasis that we've had for multiple years now on reducing chronic absenteeism across our schools. Next slide. I'm going to go through a series of slides now, and I'm going to recap and share with you the different changes that have been made in the accountability system. And across the top of each one of these slides, you will see one or more of the 3 priority focus areas to address which of these priority focused areas are being addressed with this specific change. So first, with respect to student group reporting, this is different than student group weights, which we will talk about in a little bit. But in thinking about student group reporting, one of the things that we talked about was making sure that the way in which we were capturing economically disadvantaged students was consistent across all schools. We know that we chose to use the at-risk designation, and federal guidelines require us to identify an economically disadvantaged student group. We'd had a lot of conversations around the fact that the at-risk group as defined is not necessarily consistent with the economically disadvantaged student group. And so we also know that there are different groups of students included in the at-risk definition in different grade bands of schools. And so the decision that was made is to continue to utilize the economically disadvantaged language, which exists in the ESSA plan currently. But in practice, we are going to no longer be using the quote unquote at-risk student group that's defined and used in a variety of ways. We are essentially using the at-risk group minus the overage component. That does not mean that we are going to lose sight of or lose transparency of the performance of those overage students. We are committed to continuing to represent those on the report card as a disaggregated group, but allowing us to measure these economically disadvantaged group in this way, make sure that the economically disadvantaged group represents the same student group populations in elementary, middle, and high school. With regard to students with disabilities, we heard a lot of different feedback from stakeholders across the board around concerns around masking performance of students with disabilities by getting too intricate in how you disaggregate or combine the performance, recognizing that the performance of the students with disabilities group is varied, and that group in and of itself is quite diverse. We want to make sure that what we are responding to is meeting the needs of our parents, communities, and the users of the report card. And more than anything, we heard that people want to see access to the types of resources and supports that are available for students with disabilities, the types of programming and students with disability support or staffing that's available and has routinely been available at schools. That is something that can be explored further in future report card development, but is not a component of an ESSA accountability plan. Next slide. With respect to how we measure the progress of our English learners, we measure that progress through their performance on the access assessment. Specifically, it is a growth measurement between how they score with access in one administration versus another. We have changed the exit criteria on the access assessment from 5.0 to 4.5. This has been a discussion over multiple years. As you may recall, when we first applied for and received the approval of the Essa plan, we noted that the access assessment had changed and that Aussie was committed to reviewing that new access assessment. This is the first opportunity for us to actually make that change formally in our Essa plan. And this change from 5.0 to 4.5 was actually implemented within all of our access assessments and at all schools this year, but it'll be integrated into our Essa plan with the inclusion of it in our access growth measure. With respect to the access growth methodology, there was a significant amount of data reviewed and research done on how English learners attain language proficiency. And as a result, new nonlinear targets for that growth will be established. And so the methodology has changed from a linear targeted methodology to one that is nonlinear, more reflective of how English learners attain language proficiency. It also allows us to calculate these targets based on year-to-year growth and award points for the proportion of the growth goals that are met, not simply a binary yes or no decision, which better rewards growth and creates a better equitable representation of our English learners' progress. Next slide, please. With respect to attendance, we know that in the current system, we have what is called a best of measure. That means that some schools received a metric score for 90%, which is simply the inverse of chronic absenteeism, or attendance growth. They did not receive both. We also know from our statistical reviews, and something that you have talked about often as well, is the fact that attendance growth is less associated with socioeconomic levels. We know that chronic absenteeism continues to be a struggle within our schools and across our schools, and that simply not measuring it does not make it go away. We know that it is not the same across all schools. And in fact, in some schools, we see within the same neighborhood, very different rates of chronic absenteeism, which are directly addressed by supports and programs and structures that are supported by our schools and by our LEAs, and something that we think is essential to include in our measurement. So we are replacing the 90% attendance with chronic absenteeism. This is consistent with the reporting that we have done over the last 2 years during COVID. As you are also aware, chronic absenteeism is already a requirement to be on the DC school report card. This is simply taking that 90% attendance, renaming it as chronic absenteeism. It is simply the inverse. And then we are also replacing the ISA measure with attendance growth so that every school has a measure of chronic absenteeism as well as attendance growth. And then where we had pre-K ISA, we will be replacing that with pre-K chronic absenteeism. Next slide. We have several revisions in the high school metrics. Specifically, as you know, back in 2019, we first brought a proposal to you for including a high school growth metric into the accountability system. We have committed and stayed committed to that, and we have proposed in this amendment to add that relative growth metric for ELA and one for math that will be included in the 2024 accountability calculations. The reasons for that, as you know, we did not have statewide assessments in 1920 or in 2021. So using multiple years of data, the first year that we would be able to implement this after a set of metric rules modeling and test for validity would be in 2024. We have also added the 5-year ACGR rate into the accountability system. This also then adds that into our long-term goals and provides an opportunity to better reward schools that are continuously supporting students towards graduation after the 4-year time period. We have also added dual enrollment to what used to be an AP and IB participation metric. We know that as a district, we had significant investments in dual enrollment, and a number of our high schools have really moved in that direction of making dual enrollment more accessible to more students. And we want to make sure that we're able to capture that in our accountability system. Right now, the best way that we can capture that is through participation. It doesn't mean that that's the only way in the future that it can be captured, but right now that's the data that's available that we'd be able to integrate immediately into our accountability system in 2023. We also made the decision to remove the SATDC percentile. We have kept the SAT college and career readiness metric, but we removed the DC percentile after statistical reviews showed that there was both a strong association with socioeconomic levels, as well as very little meaningful differentiation for that metric across schools. Next slide, please. One of the things that we looked at was really thinking about what are some of the drivers for strengthening equity, for addressing equity, how we better reward growth, and thinking about all those other changes that we just talked about. We know that the total metric points on our accountability system totals 100. And so we wanted to take a look at that with the changes that we were making and adjust our metric points accordingly. One of the things that you'll see is that we made a significant investment in the weight for student growth. In addition to changing the methodology of access growth, in addition to adding an attendance growth metric, we recognize from statistical analysis that growth is one of the large drivers and levers for addressing equity concerns. So as a result, we have changed the median growth percentile weight to 25 for ELA and math. The growth to proficiency has also been changed to 25 for ELA and math. That is an increase of 5 points per metric. So what you'll notice is that that other academic indicator and academic growth indicator, that second indicator is now worth a total of 60 points, 3 times the weight of academic achievement. We also made slight changes in some of the school quality and student success metrics. You'll see that for the elementary and middle schools, we made a slight decrease in chronic absenteeism from 7.5 points down to 5. Attendance growth was maintained at 5, which is what ISA was previously. And then we also decreased re-enrollment from 7.5 down to 5. That gives us greater flexibility of being able to take those metrics and move them into our growth measures. Next slide, please. On the high school side, we had significant changes as we talked about all of the other metrics. So we also were introducing a high school growth measure, recognizing that growth in high school is very different than it is in elementary and middle school. You're looking at a limited window of how you're measuring growth. You're also looking at end of course assessments versus grade level assessments. And so in conversations around that and recognizing that this is the first time that we will be bringing a growth measure into high school, we have added the high school growth metric, which will be implemented in 2024 at 12.5 points. Our 5-year graduation rate is at 9 points, which is the same metric point weight that the extended years metric previously had, but obviously a calculation that actually better rewards growth since it's looking at a full 5-year universe versus just a 4-year universe. We maintained the rate for proficiency at 15. One of the things that you will find is unique is you don't see that column for high school that's calling out specifically academic growth or other academic indicators. That's a function of the Essa law, in which they require high schools to put both student achievement and academic growth in the same indicator column. English language proficiency is maintained at 5, and you'll see that chronic absenteeism, attendance growth are both 7.5 points, recognizing the elevated emphasis on the challenges that we have in the growing increased chronic absenteeism and absenteeism rates overall at high school by both rewarding attendance growth at the same rate as we're measuring student chronic absenteeism. Re-enrollment is still set at 5. And then by adding the AP IB dual enrollment participation, we increased that metric from 5 points up to 7.5, recognizing that we were adding in dual enrollment and wanting to reward that a little bit more since we were able to broaden the expansiveness of that universe. Next slide, please. One of the things that we have talked about quite significantly, and is probably one of the more complicated features in our accountability system, is how we have applied specific weights to student group performance. Many states across the country only measure schools based on an all students performance. They don't place a specific weight on student groups. What DC committed to doing in their ESSA plan was not only measuring the performance of all students, but also measuring the students' performance in each one of those student groups: economically disadvantaged, students with disabilities, English learners, and each race ethnicity in a relative manner, meaning that they are compared and measured based on the performance of just students in that same student group, recognizing that that gives us an opportunity to set goals and targets for each of those metrics to help close the gaps of performance that we see across metrics. When we first set these student group weights, it was the first time ever doing something like this and moving away from what used to be 100% view of all students. Was the first time that we had moved out. And so looking at that, we had 75% weight placed on all students. We heard significantly that that significant weight of all students in the system really did not allow for schools serving a larger proportion of economically disadvantaged, students with disabilities, English learners, to really benefit from showing the progress that they were making with their student groups compared to other students in that same student group. And it was not truly reflective of the population in DC. So one of the things that we committed to change was looking at how we could change these student groups to better reward and to be more representative of the populations that our schools are serving. So as a result, we have proposed to decrease the all students group from 75 to 30%, increase the economically disadvantaged to 40%, leaving SWD and EL the same, and then keep increasing our race ethnicity to 15. We had significant conversations around changing the students with disabilities and the English learners. We felt, and after talking with a number of our LEA stakeholders as well, is that the way in which those student groups were disaggregated, the way in which they were measured, and the way in which the floors and targets are utilized, that those weights were appropriate for the small populations that some schools serve. And there was significant concern about overweighting them at this point in time. And so the decision was to make this proposal and look to see if this addresses, combined with all of the other changes, addresses some of the changes. We believe that it, based on some early statistical tests using antiquated data, and actually, obviously not integrating all of the other changes, we know that making changes to these student group weights, specifically the economically disadvantaged group weights and the all students weight being decreased, are significant drivers for increasing the equity in these calculations. Next slide. One of the commitments that we made early on was the accountability calculation. So our accountability calculations are based on a combined student group weighted metric score. So you saw the weights on the last slide. Those weights are applied at the metric level. Those metric scores are then combined to have an overall grade span score or grade span calculation. If a school serves multiple grade spans, then you combine those grade span calculations at a proportional level to the population of the grade span that generates a school level accountability calculation. If a school only serves a single grade span, then that grade span calculation is their school level accountability calculation. In addition to generating the school level, we also must generate a student group score using all of those metric scores for that individual student group. And then those overall calculations, as well as the student group calculations, are used in our ESSA required designation identifications for comprehensive and targeted support. Aussie has been committed to being transparent in those calculations. And while we have been very clear about that commitment to transparency, we also have been very clear in our commitment that there will be no star rating or single summative rating. Previously, the calculation scores were then translated from an accountability score into a rating of 1 to 5 stars, with ranges of what the star values represented, from 0 to 20 points being 1 star, 20 to 40 being 2 stars, and so forth. We have committed that there will be no star rating or single summative rating. However, we are also committed to being transparent about the calculations of the accountability system. Next slide. There are a variety of other changes that are aligned with non-accountability framework items that you will see in the Essa Amendment as well. Some of those are related directly to changes that were made as a result of waivers and the accountability addendum over the last several years. So you'll see that our long-term goals have been adjusted to align with the recently approved 2022 accountability addendum. For those of you who may not have seen that, Aussie has received its full approval for the Essa accountability addendum. And so we have reflected, as required in that addendum, reflected the change in the long-term goals that was proposed in that addendum in our formal Essa amendment. We also had other changes to school improvement designations, their entry and exit criteria for the short-term designations, as well as what the timeline looks like for re-identification. Those were all a part of our accountability addendum and had to be included and adapted into our full Essa plan through an amendment. Next slide, please. Within the long-term goals, what you will notice is that the academic achievement for ELA and math is simply shifted 2 years to the right, meaning that it's 2 years forward. We had no assessments in 1920 and 2021, consistent with the request that we received approval from US Ed for in our addendum. Those 2 years are then considered null years for long-term goals, and the rest of the goals are shifted to the right. Within graduation rates, there have been no changes to the federal requirements for calculation, designation, and identification of graduation rates. So there has been no change to the 4-year long-term goals. Because we are adding 5-year graduation rate into our accountability system, we must also add 5-year ACGR rates for long-term goals. So what you will see in the amendment is a new set of goals, which have a baseline set at 2017-18, which was the first year of the publication of this on our DC school report card, maintaining the 90% long-term goal by 2039, consistent with the goals in our 4-year ACGR. And you'll see that that plays out over the time. The first year in which the goals would be measured in this way would be 2023. Which is consistent with the implementation of this framework. And then access growth had the same consistent 2-year gap as we saw in academic achievement, and those long-term goals were then moved forward. Next slide. School improvement designations. As you are aware, we have multiple school improvement designations for comprehensive support as well as targeted support. Comprehensive support consists of 3 different comprehensive support categories. Most often discussed are the CSI schools, or lowest 5% of schools. However, those are not the only comprehensive support designations. We also have a comprehensive support designation for low grad rate, or CSI grad rate, which is identified for schools with 4- and 5-year ACGR rates below 67%. We also then have a third category of comprehensive support, which Aussie has not yet had anyone escalate to. In part, a reason for this is that we have not had generated STAR or accountability scores for enough years to generate into this designation. And so this designation would be a student group designation, meaning a school that had been identified for additional targeted support and improvement that had not met their exit criteria after 3 years would automatically be escalated into a comprehensive support designation. Under targeted support, we actually have 2 different categories. We have additional targeted support and improvement, which is a definition that is identified every 3 years. We made our first designation in 17-18. And those are schools that have a school level student group that is performing at or below the same level of the bottom 5% of schools. And so that first designation under this new amendment would take place in 23-24. Just to clarify, that's the same for almost all of these because of the Essa addendum and the way in which our designation timeline was set forth in that addendum, with the shorter term designations happening in 22. And then last but not least, our targeted support and improvement, or TSI designation, occurs every year. And this is a slight change in methodology. We had proposed in our original ESSA plan that this designation would be a school that was underperforming 2 out of 3 years. In thinking through about what that calculation looks like and how that could create to both over-identification and duplication of identification, we revised this methodology so that it is a school with a school-level student group performing at or below the lowest 5% for 2 consecutive years. And so if you have that same student group performing at or below for 2 consecutive years, you would be designated for TSI. This is an annual designation required under ESSA, and the first designation of this definition would be in 22-23. We would continue to use our current definition until this amendment went into effect in 23. Next slide. Areas that you will not see in this amendment, but are areas that we have discussed and we will continue to look at, explore, develop, as well as continue to test some measures and consider other options, are career readiness measures. We know that's something that we are very committed to including into our accountability system, but we must first make sure that our data is high enough quality and calculated and collected in a manner that is able to be integrated into our accountability system. So it's something that I know that Aussie and the district has placed a significant emphasis on, and something that we are excited about being able to include into the accountability system in the future. We also have talked about the DC science assessment, recognizing that prior to the COVID interruption, we had only tested and used that assessment once. Before we integrate that assessment into our accountability system, we wanted to have additional years of data to be able to review and set targets appropriately before deciding to include it into our accountability system. Another area that has been talked about quite a bit is how we measure and accurately describe the support and performance that our K-2 schools are providing to students. And that's an area where we are committed to continue the revision and additional development of what this could look like over time. There's also been a lot of conversation of what it means to have on-track measures. On-track measures typically speak to course level data. As you know, Aussie is in the midst of a course level data project, and the work of that course level data will be able to help inform any development of measures such as an on-track measure. And last but not least, there's been a significant conversation around the inclusion of school climate measures. And as you know, Aussie does not, DC overall does not have a common school climate measure to be used in an accountability system or on a DC school report card. And so we can only measure those things in which we have that are common and align with the requirements under the federal accountability system. Even the conversation of bringing a school climate measure to the report card would require that we have a common tool. And that is something that Aussie is committed to having continued development and conversation with respect to, but it is not a part of the Essa Amendment. Next slide. So with respect to the next steps of the Aussie and state board engagement, as I said before, we have published the amendment on our Aussie Essa webpage. The public comment period is from June 1st through July 8th. We are presenting here at the June State Board working session. A presentation will also occur at the July State Board working session, and then we hope that there will be a vote by the State Board at your July regular meeting on our final Essa amendment. Upon that approval, we'll be able to submit it then to the U.S. Department of Education for their final approval. Next slide. And that is it. And I'll hold that and take any questions that I'm sure are out there among the members.
Thank you so much, Ms. Johnson. Before I turn to members for questions, I'm going to take presidential prerogative for a moment and just offer a few comments to frame the forthcoming discussion. So I want to first appreciate Aussie's work to get this Essa amendment to us in a quick fashion. We passed our resolution in January, towards the end of the month. We transmitted it to you all. We're now here in June. and you all have an amendment that is close to final for us to review. So I appreciate the time and effort that I know your team put into engaging the public, engaging with us, and getting it to this point. Second, I appreciate the focus on equity at the center, the continued focus on growth that Aussie has presented through the access growth, the addition of high school growth, the increase in the growth weight on achievement is really an important change for equity, as is the shift in the student weights, the shift towards a real focus on our economically disadvantaged students in the calculations to make sure that the children who walk through the doors of a school are being well served and that our accountability system is focusing on that. I think that's really important. Second, I appreciate the recognition that ESSA is the floor here, that what we have in the amendment is what is required of us for ESSA. And so the amendment does not go beyond what ESSA requires. And I appreciate the attention in this presentation to what else will come in discussions of the school report card and to what else the state might consider as part of our work at the state level that does not need to be approved by the US Department of Ed, which the Essa Amendment does. And then finally, I appreciate you building out a coherent plan for what comes next in the report card engagement. I think that's important both for members, but especially for the public to see the time horizon of where this work goes. So I just want to thank you for that. I have some questions that I will save till the end, but I hope we all can take that mindset of the work that is done to date into our questions so that we're looking towards the future with the questions that come. Mr. Hayworth, would you please call the questions round?
Yes, Madam President. Members, we will use the raise your hand feature. Representative O'Leary.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson, as always, for a comprehensive report. I have a lot of questions. I don't know how many times we're going to be able to ask questions. I'd rather just ask the questions, and if you could get back to us for some of them, that'd be fine. I'm not trying to put you on the spot for them at all.
If I could, I think one of the benefits of y'all asking questions is for the public to be able to hear our answers. And so to the extent that your timeline allows us to answer the questions, and to the extent that we're able to, I'd like to be able to answer as many questions as you have this evening.
Great. Okay, well, someone can yell at me and to stop then. They're quick questions. After all of the engagement is done, who makes the final decision?
With respect to what, sir?
With respect to the accountability, the whole accountability system.
Well,
everything that you went over, who makes the final decision on that?
So the final decision that comes before you is agreed upon by Superintendent Grant. She reviews that presentation and she reviews the recommendations from my team. Based on that stakeholder feedback, we have significant feedback and conversations, but ultimately the amendment that you are seeing has gone through all of those protocols and is the amendment recommendation from Dr. Grant. It is then contingent upon your board to approve that in order for us to send it forward to the State Board of Education, or to the U.S. Department of Education.
Okay, the next thing is about career readiness. We talk about career readiness, which is finally has been emphasized, but it doesn't really have anything to do with taking a specific test. All right, if we're trying to make our students ready for careers outside of going to college, and is there anything that has in the report that's going to help a student or school be judged by getting a student ready for career readiness rather than going to college? You understand what I mean? Because what is the metric? What is the metric that measures the academic part? I know that it used to be the PARCC test. All right, let's say it's not that anymore. What is going to measure career readiness? Is that going to be a part of how a school looks on some kind of an evaluation?
So currently, as I said, in this version of the Essa Amendment, we were not able to include a specific career readiness metric. It is something that I know Dr. Grant feels very strongly about moving forward on as quickly as we can. There are a lot of different ways in which career readiness can be measured. And I have the good fortune, probably both a blessing and a curse, of having previously been a CTE supervisor at a district in Maryland. And so it's something I'm quite passionate about. And part of my high school teaching experience was in a comprehensive vocational high school in Delaware. And so I'm very familiar with a lot of the areas of career readiness, but they've continued to grow over time. And right here in DC, we have significant investments in our career readiness, both from programs that have been supported by our DME, investments by our council, and investments from the mayor, but also thinking about what those look like through state identified courses of study, both CTE as well as some National Academy programs. We have programs that are preparing students that while they're here in high school and they earn what's called an industry recognized credential or a certification in certain industry and career areas. We also have courses of study that actually result in a dual enrollment program. And so they're able to earn post-secondary credits through that career readiness program that might not be your traditional 4-year course of study, but are college credits that are preparing them for post-secondary study. And so looking at all of those options and being able to identify and develop a metric that aligns both with our ESSA requirements, but also that we build the foundation for the data collection in both a timely manner as well as an accurate and fair manner is something that we're committed to doing. But it's not in this iteration of the Essa Amendment, but it is something that we're looking forward to bringing forward in the future.
So
Thank
that
you
will
very
be
much, Ms.
something that
Johnson.
would be
Representative-
identified as when you're looking at a school that you want your child to go to.
You could, yes. And right now on the DC school report card, you'll see under the school programs piece, which is something that's outside of an accountability system, but you have the ability to look now and see which of those schools offer career readiness programs. And that's something that could easily be expanded on for 2023 in terms of showing what types of programs that are available at schools beyond an accountability measure. So that could be a first step of adding that into the report card to provide more detailed information to parents when they're looking at that information.
Fabulous. Thank you. I'll ask one more question. Maybe I'll come back.
You'll have to clear that with Mr. Hayward.
Dr.
Oh,
O'Leary, I'm seeing a lot of conversation in the chat, so I want to voice this for the public. I think
Right.
because we're asking questions of Ms. Johnson and not having a discussion just among members, it's important that we keep the questions moving so that people can get their questions in and then we can go round again. So I'm going to
Okay.
have us do roughly 3-minute rounds. We don't have a timer up and running yet, but I'm going to say that was more than 3 minutes, Dr. O'Leary. So we'll go on
That's
to the
fine.
next person and then we'll do as many rounds as we need, just so everyone can get some questions in.
As someone once said, I'll be back.
I have no
you.
doubts.
Representative Patterson.
Thank you. As always, Ms. Johnson, I always appreciate when you come and present because you are so thorough. As I've said from the outset, being a co-chair of the Assessment Accountability Committee, that I wanted to make sure we're moving toward a framework that does more to indicate where there is inequities and there is needed support as opposed to an indictment on the schools and the hard work that happen every day in those schools. And so I have 3 questions, I believe, for you that I was writing down as you were doing the presentation. The first one is about the design engagement. I happened to be on the task force a long time ago when that was happening. Can you tell me how that process is going to be done a little bit and what's going to go in and who will be components of it? Is this consultants? How does that actually happen as we go through that design phase? I would like to know that. Now, I'm going to ask all 3 and then you can come back to them, okay? So that was my first question. I appreciate the redefinition with the economically disadvantaged aspect in the metrics. Really appreciate that. But I kind of want to know, how do you feel, and this may be theoretical, how you feel that's going to impact the bottom 5% performers, how that's going to stop a school like Henley the next time something comes around from them losing something like, almost $1 million, so to speak, because they received a low score, so to speak, even though we're moving away from the star, but just a low performance score. So that was my second question. How does that that new term impact the school and them receiving support? And then my last one is about tracking. I hate the term, okay, because tracking culturally just does not sit well with me whenever we use the word tracking in any type of educational area. But just wanted to know what type of things are you talking about? What type of data are you thinking about as you talk about on track? So those are my 3 questions.
All right, I'm going to take them slightly out of order because I'm going to address the one that is specific to the Essa Amendment first. So with respect to economically disadvantaged, you specifically mentioned an elementary school. And so the at-risk group, which is our economically disadvantaged group, will not be measured any differently in terms of who was included in that group. The change that will be seen will be at high schools, where overage students who were included in that at-risk group only because they were overage, not because they met any of the other qualifications for at-risk. And so economically disadvantaged, does the definition of that would not impact Henley Elementary School at all. What would make changes to their accountability system, obviously the performance that they have within the metrics, but more specifically, the fact that we have increased the weight on growth, which we know that growth is one of the strongest and most clearly connected metrics to addressing and driving equity. We also have increased the weight on our economically disadvantaged or at-risk group, as well as race ethnicity. And knowing that we are comparing the performance of those students based on just the students in that student group, it allows us to better reward and better measure the progress that schools are making that have a larger population of those schools. And so schools that have a larger population of at-risk should actually see increases in how their overall score looks, because they're being more closely measured by how their students are doing and how they're performing compared to others, given that they're performing at a high level. If you're seeing that they are performing at a significantly low level, you may see small changes, but not as much. And so where you will see the largest changes are those schools who were right on the edge or on the cusp of different performance levels previously. That's where we see the most movement, not as much on the tails, which is what you would expect in a statistically sound change. And now your other around the on track. On track is a terminology that's used oftentimes in schools. I know that it's used in the PCSB in their performance framework in terms of how students are quote unquote on track to moving to the next grade based on credit attainment. And so that's what that is meant by on track. That is definitely something that our charters have expressed interest in, as well as other stakeholders of looking for continuity across metrics, across systems. With respect to the report card, and I know I'm out of time, I'll take 10 seconds. With respect to the report card, it is my understanding that the engagement will take place utilizing student groups, all calls, public meetings, task force meetings, both in person, virtual, surveys. We would be able to show models, testing, much like we did the last time of, option A, option B, looking at different things, gathering feedback in that way, whether they be small groups, pushing into existing meetings.
Thank you very much. Representative Reed.
Good evening, Donna. And
Good evening.
Here you go. And thank you again, and Evan, for spending time with the Ed Councils. Was it a week or two ago? Late into the hour, I think almost 8 o'clock, we were on asking a variety of questions. So thank you so much. I have 3 questions. One is, and this is for me because I just don't know. What was the 90% attendance that's moving to chronic absenteeism? And then how does this shift align with the 60-40 proposed ruling? That's one. The second one is for elementary schools. The academic achievement and other academic growth, explaining like how that isn't double dipping or penalizing a school multiple times just in case there's any overlap, or just clarifying, is there overlap? Is there not overlap? And then the last question is there a summative score based on the weights for each grade span and the categories of students? So multiple scores floating around. And that's my question.
I can answer that last question first. Yes, and the way in which the calculations work is that the first calculation that is made is a metric calculation, and then those metric calculations are combined to give you a grade span or framework calculation. If a school serves multiple grade spans, that's where the grade spans are combined for a school level. Then, because we also need to identify student groups, we unpack that again all the way back down to the metrics where we look at just the individual student group score within the metric and combine those individual student group scores across the metrics and get a student group grade span score. Same would be the true if a school served multiple grade spans, then their student groups would be combined to have a school level student group score. Those scores would be what would be used to identify for targeted support. With respect to elementary and middle schools, which have the other academic indicator, you have achievement, which is a performance level 4 or 5, as defined by the definition of proficiency. And that is a required element of ESSA, and that is in the achievement domain. It's the only metric that's allowed to be in that domain for elementary and middle schools is the proficiency metric. The other academic indicator allows states to include other academic measures utilizing the statewide assessments. We have measures in there, including student level growth, which is median growth percentile, and growth to proficiency. We also have approaching expectations, which is a performance level 3, 4, or 5. And so that goes below proficiency and brings credit into the system for schools that have students who are scoring at that approaching level. And that's a metric that's been in since the beginning of the framework. And then I think you had a third question.
It was about the attendance. But I think
Thank you. The attendance. I'll come back to that one because that's a pretty lengthy question if you don't mind.
Oh, fine. Yep.
Thank you very much. Representative Parker.
Thanks, Donna. I wanted to just make sure I was tracking one of the questions that Representative Reed just asked about the score per weight. So you're saying it will be every school per grade band will have a summative score, maybe we don't want to use that term, per weight, and then that will be accumulated for their overall framework score.
Yes, that's consistent with how it is now. So
yes,
we currently have a grade span, what we call a framework, and those frameworks are combined to give an overall school calculation. We also currently have the student group calculations.
And I would just say it would be helpful to see some of this dynamically versus just talking about it theoretically. I also just want to, applaud Aussie. What I heard was an acknowledgement of the importance of growth and its connection to equity, which just seems like we're in a different place than we were maybe the first time we went through this process, which leads me to the student weights, back to the student weights. And so it was striking that for EL and students with learning disabilities, the weights remain constant. I know, for instance, students with learning disabilities is a key focus for Aussie and has been. I also know we haven't been able to move the needle there. And while I appreciate the concern from schools, I just would love to just square why we wouldn't up the ante in those areas that are a key priority and that we haven't made progress on. Connected to that, a second point there is just about the double dipping. And maybe this is what Representative Reed was trying to get at, and maybe I just didn't understand it. So if a student, for instance, counts in economically disadvantaged category and as a student with learning disabilities, is that student, their performance counted twice? Can you just explain that for me?
Yes, so they are counted in very different ways. And so they are counted as an economically disadvantaged student based on floors and targets for that metric that are relative to other economically disadvantaged students. They are measured as a student with disabilities in that student group, in that portion of the metric, based on the performance and the goals and targets for other students with disabilities. Recognizing, as we looked at, if you think back, there were a few meetings ago, we looked at a slide where we showed how the floors and targets look different for different student groups. And that really is something that can change over time to help close performance gaps.
Understood. And then just the rationale again, why we wouldn't, I guess I'm just not fully understanding why we wouldn't put more pressure on trying to move the needle for students with learning disabilities or our EL students.
Yeah, so in one of the things we know that we've made significant changes in the way in which we're measuring access growth. And so looking at the changes that we've made both in reducing the exit criteria as well as changing the methodologies, we know has a significant change for that population. But English learner weight is based on the performance of English learners in all of the metrics, not just access learning. So one of the things that we've looked at is the population of our English learners, recognizing that we have many schools that do not have a population of English learners at all. And thinking about the way in which a student group is missing from a school and those weights are distributed across other student groups in a manner that would then disproportionately weight some of the student groups in a very different manner than other student groups are being weighted by other schools. We also looked at the way in which we could further disaggregate students with disabilities from thinking about and testing out different models of how we could disaggregate students based on students with disabilities levels, primary disability codes. There were a lot of exploration areas that have been talked about and thought through about that. And repeatedly, we kept running into measures where it actually resulted in measuring fewer students with disabilities performance because of data suppression and privacy concerns when you get into such small components. And so one of the things that we've talked about is thinking about how we utilize the floors and targets of the metric within that business rule of setting floors and targets so that we are putting the focus on moving the needle more by adjusting our floors and targets. And so we're not losing a focus on these measures. We're actually using other levers to drive that. We also are thinking about how we drive the supports for students with disabilities on the report card.
Thank you. I'm way over time. And
Thank you very much. Representative Wattenberg.
I'm next. Hi, everybody.
My apologies, Representative Wattenberg. I do apologize. Representative Gasoy was right before you, and I know she has a hard stop in a second. Do you mind if
Okay.
Thank you so much.
We're good. Thank you. Sorry about that. Also, please excuse my voice. I'm doing my best.
I hope you continue to feel well.
Thank you. So thank you, and I just want to reiterate sort of the appreciation for more emphasis on growth. And my question is about support. And one of the things that our resolution really emphasizes is expanding the scope of support, both in terms of how, the percentage of schools that get attention and the differentiation or, the kind of support that they get based on what we learn from being assessed. So I guess I'm wondering where that fits in, because this is where it's kind of tricky, talking about where we separated the amendment from the conversation about the dashboard, because some of them are interconnected, right? So I guess I'll just leave it there and let you answer that. And then if I have time, I'll ask another question.
Thank you so much for that question. And one of the things that I know we talked about with the resolution was the reference to additional supports outside of those required in ESSA would not be addressed in the ESSA amendment. It is not a component of the ESSA amendment. And so where it would reside would not necessarily be on the report card, but it would be more of an Aussie policy and a focus and an initiative for Aussie. And I know it's something that Dr. Grant is very interested in pursuing and exploring and developing further. And so I would defer to her guidance and timeline around how that is further developed. As you know, we've talked about before the plethora of supports and resources that Aussie provides to schools, utilizing data to better inform and target the schools for those resources. That is something that will not end. But what a more formal school improvement model could look like, or school support or continuous improvement model could look like, is an Aussie policy decision that's outside the scope of ESSA or the DC school report card. And you have time for a question.
My other question is about the schools that are, both an elementary and a middle school. Mm-hmm. For instance, Meridian, which is like, they're two different schools, two different buildings, two different principals, but they get assessed as one school. I'm just wondering why that is, what the thinking is behind that, because they really are different schools.
So the reason is quite simple. They have one single school code and did not apply for separate school codes. If they applied as two separate schools, they would have two separate school codes. We have a number of schools that have smaller grade spans and they have unique school codes because they have submitted and requested to have a specific school code for that school. Meridian, for example, is one school code. And they then have an elementary framework and a middle school framework for the accountability system.
Can they change that if they want? I'm not saying they want to, but can.
Sure, that's up to them.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Representative Wattenberg, now it's your turn. Thanks for being patient.
Thank you. Thanks, Donna. Thanks, everybody, for the good questions. So I want to go back to the beginning and ask you a broad question, which is part of what you talk about is that the purpose of this is to improve equity. And I want to hear from you what you mean by that.
So one of the things that we've talked about is improving the equity in the measurement of the accountability system. And by looking at that, one of the targets that we've had is—
No, but I mean, what does equity mean? I'm not talking about how you measure it, but the result of having more equity means what in this context?
So in this context, we have been specific about this being the equity in the measurement, meaning that the way in which the measurement is calculated and the results of those are less associated with socioeconomic levels and specific demographic levels, making sure that the system is not designed in a way that is less beneficial or less of an accurate or reflective measurement of schools serving historically underserved students.
So as an example, when you talk about moving from to more growth, for example, from performance, and I'm all for growth as to me, it's the most important measurement of the quality of a school. But if I'm trying to push resources to schools that need them the most, I would want to be very clear about pushing resources to schools where the absolute scores or the proficiency levels were very low. So to me, when you think of this as a formula that is going to lessen proficiency, I wonder if that is more equitable.
So we actually haven't decreased the weight on proficiency at all. We have actually taken weights from other metrics to add to growth. We did not decrease the weight of proficiency. So you'll see that the proficiency metrics have the exact same weight that they had previously. However, as you know, when we had No Child Left Behind, that purely was a proficiency model. One of the benefits of the Every Student Succeeds Act is using multiple measures, recognizing that supports are not just driven by achievement, but supports are needed in a variety of ways. For example, when you think about chronic absenteeism, recognizing that even as low as pre-K, measures of chronic absenteeism are leading indicators of whether or not a student will be reading on grade level by third grade. So being able to see the data for chronic absenteeism at pre-K and kindergarten and be able to direct the appropriate supports there allow you to direct supports and result in academic achievement overall. And so a lot of these measures, and one of the benefits of Essa overall, was not moving away from No Child Left Behind, which was only proficiency.
But I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to just jump in. But when you talk about the equity, part of what you talk about a lot is we're gonna reward schools for growing more. In fact, if they grow past a certain amount, part of the reward is they're not going to be able to get the resources. So in other words, how you judge a school in order to give it a quality score is almost the inverse, almost the opposite of how you would judge a school in order to give it more resources. So when I come back, I want to ask, you talked about at the cusp, some of these schools would change. And I am curious about whether it's going to, for the 5% of schools, whether schools that are more in need are going to be getting the resources or not. So, but my time is up, so we'll come back to that.
Yeah, real quick, I think we're muddying the waters between overall calculation and supports. And
the supports go to people based on the overall calculation, though.
No, that's only for the lowest 5%, and that's only for the federal school improvement grant.
That's the only thing that's in the amendment, though, right? I thought that's the only thing we're talking about.
We're talking about the accountability system, which is for all schools. We're talking about the accountability system is used to identify comprehensive support schools as well as targeted support schools. Targeted support schools are not your schools with the lowest 5%. They are schools with student groups performing significantly low, and it's across all measures, not just a single.
That's a very good point and a fair point. Sorry, my questions really were more about the comprehensive support.
Sure, the comprehensive support is defined in federal law, the lowest 5% of schools.
No, I understand, and it's defined in a way that's supposed to make sure that the funding goes to the most needy of those 5%. And I'm saying that as we put in some of these other metrics that I really was very supportive of in terms of if this was a rating, it may have an inverse effect at the level of giving schools support. And if you're only giving the 5% the support, it's an issue. So, but like I say, you move on. I'll come back to this.
Thank you very much. Representative Thompson.
Dawn.
Hi.
Awesome job as always, being thorough. I really appreciate seeing growth metrics in particular. I will say that it is the area that when this was first adopted, and it was the one thing that people were like, we need more growth. I'm thrilled to see a growth metric in high school. I'm thrilled to see it increase in the growth weights. I do want to focus a little bit on the shift to in-seat from in-seat attendance to chronic absenteeism, because I have some assumptions and I want to check my assumptions. And so I think my assumption is you are making this shift because if a kid shows up for school, a lot of times has very little to do with all the things the school might do to get them there. So if I think about, I don't know, pick on Ward 3. If Jenny probably has close to 100% of kids showing up at school every day. Maybe, I don't know, Drew or Null does not, but Drew or Null might be jumping through hoops to get their kids into school. And so I would assume that this shift to measuring changes in chronic absenteeism is a nod to the efforts schools are putting in to address the issues they see with populations that are not already showing up. Is that correct? Is that like the why, or is it something else?
It's a little bit of a both and. And
Okay.
so in terms of thinking about in-seat attendance is a metric that's a historic metric. It's a way in which people have measured the average rate of attendance in a school. But in-seat attendance in and of itself, with the statistics and the analysis that was run, recognizing there was not a significant difference or meaningful differentiation between schools in terms of what that looked like. And in fact, in some cases, our floors and targets were so narrow that it was really hard for schools to actually show any progress in that metric or any differentiated performance. But in terms of attendance growth and our chronic absenteeism, recognizing that the 90% measure is simply the inverse of chronic absenteeism. We had previously set up a system where schools got either or. And the design of that initially was thinking about that some schools may be having significant growth, and that might be higher than chronic absenteeism. What we've seen, both as a country as well as DC, is that chronic absenteeism is an issue that has continued to grow. We recognize that there is a continued focus and necessary focus on making sure that students are not chronically absent. Whether a day is counted as 80 or 20 or 60 or 40, it is still a day. And so if they have more days absent, then they're at risk of being more chronically absent. There are a wealth of studies that talk about the impact that chronic absenteeism has on future, both academic achievement as well as career achievement and actually life achievement. But we also recognize that attendance growth gives us the opportunity to reward those schools that are doing those things that are above and beyond. You know, I looked at this and I looked at some of our data and I made a couple of notes in advance, but we see chronic absenteeism rates that are very different at schools that are just blocks from one another. A school that has a chronic absenteeism rate serving 6th to 8th graders at 71%, but yet blocks away is another school with the same population, the same demographics, and theirs is just 35%. And they're in the same LEA. What's the difference? What's the change? What is this school doing to bring students to class and to school and participating in instruction in a way that is significantly different? And how do we measure that? How do we reward it? How do we address the supports that are needed? And so that's really what both attendance growth and chronic absenteeism gives us the ability to do.
Thank you very much. President Sutter.
Thank you, Mr. Hayworth. So I want to start, Donna, by giving you a chance to respond to the attendance question that Dr. Reed asked.
Yes, so you were asking about, and can you restate that just real quickly to make sure I have it correctly, but I think it had to do with 60-40 and 80-20.
Sure, and I think a piece of it may have been kind of tapped into.
I tried.
Representative Thompson's question. I was asking, just for my knowledge, what was the 90% attendance? Like, what was that? And then previously, just the definition of it. And then I think I get what chronic absenteeism now, but how does it align or play into the 60-40 move, which I think you also touched on.
Yep, so I tried to touch on that. So whether a school day is defined as 80-20 or 60-40, it's still defined as a school day. However, a school day is defined. And so if 60-40 results in students being present more days, that means that they're absent fewer days. And so that would potentially have the ability to reduce the number of students who are chronically absent if there are less days by which they're absent. With respect to the 90% attendance, 90% attendance was simply a calculation of the percentage of students who attended school 90% or more of their enrolled days. The exact inverse of chronic absenteeism. Chronic absenteeism is the percentage of students enrolled in a school that miss 10% or more of their enrolled days. So it doesn't have to be 18 days. It is based on the number of days they've been enrolled in that school. If they're only enrolled in the school for 30 days and they miss 4 days, then they're chronically absent because that is more than 10% of the days of which they've been enrolled.
Representative Sutter.
Thank you so much, Donna. Okay, so I have two questions. My first is around modeling data. So you've been talking a little bit about these changes. I'd love to know, has Aussie been able to model using, say, 2019 data, any of these changes? And how does it affect how schools fare in the accountability system?
So I want to acknowledge that, but I also want to give an opportunity in this answer to, if Mr. Kramer is available, to have him be able to address this as well in terms of in a lot of this work. We actually started this conversation back in 2019, where we were prepared and getting ready to make amendment changes then before everything in our world stopped. And so we had started using data back then, changing and modeling with different student group weights, thinking about what different metric weights might do, specifically around that concern around the association with socioeconomic levels and how that responded to both metric scores as well as to overall accountability scores. And so we modeled a lot of different things using that data. One of the things that's really important, and I think at the core of our decision making, is the fact that we do not want to base a decision based on names that we see in a chart. This is really thinking about the overall spread of the data, the impact and the statistical impact of the data, as well as the philosophical core foundational principles for accountability. So we've tried to stay true to those and not base a decision on whether or not school ABC showed up on this side of a line or that side of a line. But in terms of the actual details of some of those metrics and some of those correlations that we saw, I want to give Evan a chance to speak to that directly. And it was really his team who was doing a lot of this work.
Yeah, it all feels like ancient history. It's good to be with you all, by the way. It feels like ancient history when we did this a long time ago, but the things that we were looking for, as Donna noted, were to what degree were we able to decouple the relationship or weaken the relationship between socioeconomic status and the score that a school received. That was sort of top of mind in all of the modeling we did. It's worth noting that, the most recent data we have completely are from 2019. And we know that the pandemic has not affected everyone equally. And so trying to make assumptions about how moving this piece over here has a very isolated effect on what is ultimately going to happen in the sort of sum of calculations is just a dangerous proposition generally. So we have tried both to be rigorous in our methodology and in our analysis, while also being clear that hewing too closely to those numbers builds up assumptions that may not hold anymore. And so that's sort of the best way I can respond to the philosophical aspect of what we're trying to do with the quantitative aspect of what we're trying to do.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that a lot, because I think it also sets up the appropriate expectations for both members and the public that the decisions made were done with this expectation and philosophical tenet of decoupling socioeconomic status, demographics as destiny from the accountability system and the way the metrics are designed. But then we all got thrown a curveball of the pandemic, and we don't have any data that is during or post-pandemic yet to model this with. So I appreciate that. Thank you. My time has expired. So Mr. Hayworth, I think we'll go to a second round of questions. And if we could keep this 1 to 3 minutes as well, that would be great.
Thank you. Representative Gasoy.
Thank you. So my other question is about the rating. And it says on slide 16 that there will be no summative rating. But there is, it sounds like there's going to be a score or something. So I guess I'm interested in hearing how you're seeing the difference there, how you're differentiating between sort of a score and a rating or a summative. What does it say on the slide? Anyway, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so in order to identify our lowest 5%, we must have a score. In order to identify the lowest performing student groups, we must have a score. And what Aussie is committed to is being transparent with that calculation. There's been a lot of conversation, including conversations that you've been a part of, in people communicating that they want to see that score lower on the page. They want to see that score with some type of narrative or explanation. They want to see that score with some type of description or context around how the school may be performing compared to schools serving similar populations. They want to see the different domains and indicators indicated more prominently on the page with the score in smaller text. That's all report card design and functionality. That is not a part of the ESSA calculation methodology. And so when we're tasked with creating the Essa Amendment, we are tasked with explaining how the accountability score is calculated. And that is what we have done in the Essa Amendment, is identify how the score is calculated. Aussie has been transparent in its commitment to transparency, in that with that calculation, we do not intend to hold that back and not make that available to the public. Quite frankly, to make that be something that was subject to someone requesting it via FOIA would truly be an inequitable access of data. And that is not something that we want to do.
Right. Would Aussie consider, and I know this is a display question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, consider having that score in a separate place, like on the website versus on a report card?
Well, the report card is the place in which accountability data must be displayed. And so I think Aussie has been very clear about making sure that we are putting information available in the place that is our ESSA related accountability space. And so placing it somewhere else on the website is really obfuscating the information from the public. I will not state to where or how. I think that would be a disservice to the additional stakeholder engagement that is forthcoming. And so we have heard from people already that there is a desire to not have it on the profile page. We have heard already that there is a desire to have it more towards the bottom of the page. And in meetings that you know that I've been in, I've acknowledged that and been very receptive to that, as have other members of our team. One of the things that I do not want to do is commit Aussie to a specific location, design, display without further stakeholder engagement. If we did that at this point, as others have called for, it would be a disservice to the external engagement that's yet to come.
Thank you
Okay.
very much. Representative O'Leary.
Couple of questions, short questions. A student starts in the 9th grade at X high school and then leaves that school and goes someplace else, and they're lost track of. Are they still counted as not being part of the graduating class 4 years later?
Which school are they enrolled in?
Let's say they're enrolled at Cardozo High School.
Okay, so they started their 9th grade year at Cardozo
Right.
and they
Then-
exited Cardozo and transferred somewhere else.
Somewhere else, but we don't know where.
We don't know where. And so we
Right.
don't have any records to show that
Right.
they enrolled in another school,
Right,
in another state or another place.
right.
Under the federal definitions of the adjusted graduation cohort, they are the responsibility of Cardozo, and that is a federal definition of adjusted cohort.
Is there anything we can do about that lunacy?
Fraser, I'm
You don't
going
have
to,
to call
I'm
it, you
going
don't
to,
have to call it
I'm
lunacy.
going to refrain from telling you to lobby your congressman. But much to the chagrin of President Sutter. But yeah, that's a congressional, that's a federal change. That's not something that we can do at Aussie. That's a definition of adjusted cohort. You're on mute, Dr. O'Leary. And you still have over a minute and a half.
Is there any way that we can set up a system like the access system for ELL students, for students who don't read at the grade level at the beginning of the school year?
You know, I think that there are probably a lot of different tools that schools can use. I'm not an expert in those, but I'm sure that there are tools that can measure those types of things. I think a number of schools use some type of literacy screener, but those are typically used at the individual school level. We don't have a state level measure like that.
Is it something that's been discussed?
Not within the accountability space. Whether it's been discussed in the teaching and learning space, I'm not aware of, but
Okay.
in the literacy conversations, I'm sure that there's conversations about how to measure that at a
And
school level.
I have two more things that I think I can get through. I really appreciate what you were saying about how schools are not the same, and one size does not fit all. And it's 2022, and we need to understand that all of our schools are unique. Thank you so much, Donna.
Thank you, Dr. Larry.
Thank you. Representative Wattenberg.
Hello.
Hello.
All right, I want to go a little bit back to where we were. So just talking about what's going to happen under the new system. You talked a lot about you're trying to, part of what you've redone is the indicators so as to reward schools that do well. And you talked about rewarding schools with more growth, rewarding schools that I guess had more IB or AP, and how are they rewarded?
So what we've talked about is designing a metric that rewards growth. And
But
so
I know, but
schools that have
they get a
increased
higher,
growth,
they get a higher metric, but that's not a reward. That's like a higher number on a page. But are they getting rewarded for it? Are they being incentivized some way?
if you're asking for financial support,
I'm
that is
asking,
not,
you're calling it a reward, and I'm asking what is the reward?
we're using that term as rewarded in the overall calculation. That is what that terminology means, is being recognized as an increase in an overall calculation.
All right. So now, okay, now let me flip to this question about, and other people have asked it, but I'm going to come back to it, which is to try to understand, as a result of these changes, what's going to actually change. There's only going to be still 5% of the schools getting support, even though that was one of the main things that we raised, was how that was so inadequate. So on the cusp, I mean, what can you give us some example of how this will change? Why is this going to be better for schools in DC? Why should we vote for this? Why is it going to be better for a school?
So the first thing that I will say is that when we talk about federal funding, it is a very limited, specific federal fund. And so there are a lot of other funds that our schools receive. In fact, you can see the increased federal funds. You can see that there are grants that.
I don't want to use my time. Sorry.
I recognize that.
It, but insofar as this, are you saying that those grant funds are going to be awarded based on these numbers? Because otherwise it's not part of this discussion. That I'm just trying to understand
So grants are based on metric performance at times as one of the categories that can target schools for performance. That hasn't changed. But why should
in other words, so part of what we're voting for here, I want to be clear, is that these metrics are going to be the basis for how some schools get additional grants. Is that part of what you're saying?
It will be the data that is used. Yes, we use accountability data as indicators, not for sole decision-making, but as identifiers for schools that are more targeted for such grants or supports. But why should you vote for this? You should vote for this because this addresses an increase in growth, recognizing and rewarding schools for supporting growth. You should vote for this because it increases the weight that addresses the association with socioeconomic that you've cared about.
But what it doesn't do is it doesn't,
All right,
I mean,
Representative Wattenberg,
Excuse me. Yeah, I want to remind members about conduct.
I'm sorry, I'm allowed to have a discussion, I think. I'm trying to get an answer to the question, but my time is up, so I will drop back.
Representative Wattenberg, I want everyone to get their questions answered.
Which is why I'm stopping. I totally agree.
Representative Wattenberg, I don't want representatives speaking over the person who is speaking at a given time. I am happy to extend time. I think we've been generous with time and we can continue to do that.
That would be
but
great.
I just want to make sure that everyone can get to answer a question they are asked. So Representative Wattenberg, I'd like to have Ms. Johnson finish and then you can respond and then we'll move on, Mr. Hayward.
So with respect to the supports that are available to schools, supports are outside. There are many supports outside of the ESSA plan. And so in this plan, one of the specific supports that's tied to this plan is the financial investment for the bottom 5%. However, there are also supports that can be built in through the development of plans for schools that are identified for targeted support for student groups. We also know and have communicated previously that we use the accountability data, whether it be metric data, student group data, indicator level data, to identify schools and target specific resources to them, whether it be professional development, other grants, whether they be local or federal grants. So as grants that might deal with attendance, we would look at the data and look at those schools with the highest levels of chronic absenteeism and target those schools in an organized manner to participate and receive the supports through those programs. So the changes made to these metrics impact the way in which the data is used in those supports.
All I'm going to say is it sounds like the way in which it will affect who's in the 5%, and for that matter, any list is going to be at the cusp. So that's what you're not saying anything that changes my perspective on that. So thank you very much. And we're going to get one more round, President Sutter.
I think if folks have questions, we'll go as long as Ms. Johnson's able to
And
stay.
thank you, Donna. And I appreciate being able to have the conversation. Sometimes that's just what happens in a conversation.
Thank
you, ma'am.
Representative Parker.
A statement and then a question. The statement is just about like the summative versus being transparent with the data. And the concern that I originally heard, and I continue to hear from a lot of parents and educators, but more so parents, especially connected to our neighborhood schools, is that they feel as though, and they felt as though the star rating was unfair for their schools or didn't tell a full story. And I appreciate that Aussie has agreed to move away from that. I will also acknowledge that I'm not really clear on what the destination is. I totally get the point about being transparent, and I agree that we should share the data. But I just want to make clear that we should not be replacing stars with any other metric or any other figure, while at the same time, I would be supportive of sharing those numbers that come from the calculation, if that makes sense. Put more plainly, I wouldn't want to see that at the top of a school report card personally. That would not be something I would be willing to vote for. But at the same time, I agree that if parents want that information, they should have access to it. I look at Massachusetts report card as an example where they still very much provide that information, but it is tucked away for parents that want to find it. Just putting that out there, because I think it feels like, and I don't think this is your intention, it feels like moving or hiding the ball a little bit. And I'm just not clear where we're landing. And so if you can provide any clarity there, that would be helpful. And then the other thing is more about the growth metrics and using 1920 data to this year's data. And I believe that is is that not what we're doing? No, okay. We're using this year's data.
Next year's data.
And next year's data. And I guess the question still holds. Should this year be an anomaly as we expect it will be in terms of performance being all over the place? Like what flexibilities have we built into the amendment that would allow us to change course if necessary? Or will we have to come back and make adjustments should this year's data really just throw us for a loop?
I want to address that question first. First and foremost, you don't build in flexibilities of a one-off nature into an amendment. A one-off nature flexibilities are requested through a waiver, as we did in 1920 and 2021. Should we be in a situation where we were unable to calculate growth in a valid manner, then we would present that as a waiver request from calculating those metrics to US Ed. That would be a standalone waiver. It would not be an amendment. An amendment talks about the long-term path of your system with respect to the overall calculation. One of the things that you saw Aussie shift to this year was a dashboard-like approach to displaying the report card, in which you saw individual tiles that indicated the different domain areas, such as attendance, enrollment, college and career readiness. There, a lot of different information that was there and shown in different tiles. If you could imagine that, I'm not going to bring it up. I don't think I can do that. But if you could bring up the DC school report card currently, imagine that there's another tile there that says accountability. In order to see that information, you'd enter that domain. So that would be a choice that you would make from the landing page of your school's report card. And then you would choose to go in there and look at all of the different metrics, student group scores and performance that compiled that overall calculation, ideally with that calculation, more than likely appearing towards the bottom of that page as you scroll down. Is that helpful?
That is helpful. That is helpful. Thank you.
Representative Thompson.
Since we're not quite at the finish line yet, I want to underscore my support for one more thing. Giving schools credit for the 5-year graduation rate. I think that is hugely important. I want to see that on any final version of this. So first, I wanted to just underscore that. Second, as we think about like what this could look like, I think about schools I have who do a tremendous job on growth and this narrative around, and I think it's true that our current report card and STAR framework doesn't quite do them justice. My expectation would be that if they're doing a phenomenal job with growth, even if their proficiency levels stay the same, right? Then I would see higher, like their calculations would be wildly better and more reflective of the job they're doing at schools. I went to an event this weekend, so shout out to Allison Kreiner Brown, and she mentioned that Beers, which is one of my schools, is a 2-star school, but we all know it's not a 2-star school. I think we all know it's not a 2-star school because of the work they're doing in that building and the way they are moving kids and the way they support kids. So that's at least how I'm thinking about why this addition of the growth metric is important, is that I want to see how aligned that is to the way Aussie is thinking about this.
Yeah, so absolutely. Thinking about how we increase growth, we recognize that growth is a result of many different efforts and supports that our schools give to their students. Not just academic supports, but supports in getting to school and being there and being present and being engaged. The courses and the materials and the programming and the instructional strategies that are used encourage students to stay engaged and come to school, and that increases learning. And so we see that occur over time. And so as you see growth continuing to grow, we recognize that that is one of those leading indicators that eventually, hopefully, leads to more proficient. Obviously, we do want all of our students to be proficient, but we recognize that recognizing and rewarding growth with more points in the system is definitely a lever to driving that and being a more equitable representation in the overall calculation of how our schools are supporting student learning. I also want to address the long-term growth question in the chat, which I'll do for Representative Patterson.
You're welcome to use my time to do that.
Representative Patterson, the long-term growth for graduation rate is 90%. It does not change. It is not 85%. It's 90%, and that remains the same, unchanged from previously.
Thank you. I'm sorry about the percentage. I knew it was somewhere therein, but
You're welcome.
5%, but thank you for that.
Sure.
Representative Reed.
Okay. So Donna, actually, I think the question that Representative Wattenberg was asking about financial support, it also came up during the Education Council engagement that we did. And my question is, in the Essa plan or amendment, is there a requirement to describe how the federal, I'm definitely probably thinking how the federal financial supports are going to be used, or how federal dollars will be used? But then is there also a requirement to talk about the local dollars and how you might do anything additional related to any, I guess, category scoring?
So no, there's not a requirement to talk about any local dollars or local additional categories. There is a requirement to identify whether you use those federal, what are called 1003B or school improvement funds, whether you use those funds and you distribute them in a formulaic manner or a competitive grant proposal. And we have outlined them in a formulaic model. We also have spoken to the fact that even if we identified more schools than the bottom 5%, that funding does not get increased from the federal government. And so the funding that you receive is a flat amount based on the calculation that they have based on the students that we have enrolled in our schools and the size of our jurisdiction. And so looking at that, recognizing that that number doesn't change no matter how many schools you spread the supports between, we made the decision back in 2017 to award those school improvement funds only to the bottom 5%, because recognizing that we were looking between 10 and 12 schools based on the 5% count of our total schools, that would allow meaningful funding for school improvement to take place. Obviously, school improvement can't take place solely with that, but is more meaningful than spreading it out between 30 schools, which would just be a small amount that really would not result in actionable improvement. And yet your plan is a significant school improvement plan. So to ask people to take on a significant plan with very high exit criteria as mandated through Essa and not give them the most amount of funds that you could seemed unjust.
Gotcha. So to do it sounds like there's an interest in local support. What would be your recommendations for vehicles for providing additional supports to schools to get them to be as productive as possible related to this framework?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of different things that you could do around supporting schools, both from, having models in which you have leadership levels, you have different opportunities to go in and visit and do preliminary visits of schools and thinking about and identifying needs assessments. Schools could utilize some of their existing federal funds or state funds to do a needs assessment from whether it be from asking Aussie to come in or asking others. I mean, there's a wide array of things that are being done across the country. And I think that one of the things that schools could do is utilize the time and looking at the data to identify proactively where supports are needed and to really maximize and invest in things that have a truly significant impact on moving the needle in those areas. And so when we think about the investments in high impact tutoring, making sure that you're monitoring the progress of those initiatives to see, are your students attaining more proficiency? Are they hitting your growth goals that you've established, to determine whether or not those types of investments, but look at the scope of school improvement options out there and invest in those. And I think that's something that can be done as groups of schools, as a state, as individual school. There's a wide array of opportunities there.
Thank you very much. President Sutter.
Thank you, Mr. Hayworth. After I ask my second round of questions, we will do one final round. So members, this is your last call. If you have additional questions, we'll do one last round of questions. Thank you for everything, Ms. Johnson. So I wanted to ask two clarifying questions on things that are discussed in the deck. One is, you talk about the ATSI and the TSI and when schools will be identified for these designations using the new criteria. Can you just voice over for the public how many schools typically fall in that bucket? Because the board put in our resolution a hope that Aussie would identify something in the bottom 25% of schools for additional supports. But these are schools that are falling short on specific subgroups of students or consecutive years. So I'm just curious, for the public's knowledge, how many schools are we talking that fall into these targeted supports and additional targeted supports?
So I'd have to pull up the number really quickly, but I believe in the very first year, we identified 7 schools that had underperforming student groups. And in the next year, I believe we identified either 5 or 6. So I think we have about 13 schools that are identified for low performing student groups. We also have a number of schools that are identified for low performing graduation rates. 2 of those schools exited this year because their graduation rates increased. We have, through the nature of the statutory requirements, all of our currently identified low performing graduation rate schools are alternative schools. And we recognize the unjustness of asking schools that are serving a very unique population of students who have dropped out, have re-engaged, were significantly already behind by the time they enrolled. There is some language in our Essa Amendment that you'll see addresses that, and we're hopeful that US Ed is receptive to that, because we recognize that our alternative schools are doing a phenomenal job with supporting students and having them graduate. Even though they're not graduating on that 4-year rate, they're coming to them already past that window. So we want to recognize that.
Thank you. My last question for you is about the academic achievement goals. So you note in the deck that those are unchanged. And I just want you to share with the public what those are, because I think Representative Parker asked, where are we headed? And I think that's the thing that I hope the public can hear. Like, what is the goal that we have for children in DC for what it means to be receiving education that the state deems at the level of acceptable?
So in academic achievement goals, our long-term goal is set for 2041, because it's moved forward 2 years, at 85% of our students in every student group meeting proficiency. We set that based on the baseline of data from 2015-16, and then adjusted moving forward and looked at the growth that individual student groups would have to make over time. We talked about what it would mean to reset those goals at this point in time. And anything that we did to reset those goals now would not be based upon data. We know that our students have faced significant challenges, and we are all anxiously awaiting to see how they've done this year and look at the data that we have. And so any adjustments to those long-term goals can be made in the future once we have a couple of years of data to see the recovery and the path that our students are making, and then make those data-informed adjustments into our long-term goals. The way in which the long-term goals must be used in the accountability system is that the interim goal has to be included in the achievement target, meaning that the target is the point in which schools receive all of the credit for that student group on that metric. It does not adjust the floor. That's something that we have the ability to adjust. The target must be that long-term goal. And so that is a part of the statute. And so we're not changing those at this point in time because it would not be a database decision.
Thank you. John Paul, will you call the last round, please?
Yes, ma'am. Representative Wattenberg.
Hi. Okay, so I want to talk about what can go into the amendment and what can't. So I know you have said that you're not required to put these other issues about support, how you're going to report the scores, how you're going to do the report card. I know you're not required to put that into the amendment, but I believe you're allowed to based on other ESSA plans that I have looked at. You can put in other things about how you plan, how this fits into other things that you're doing, right?
Sure. I mean, you can put a lot of different things into a plan. It then has to go to USED for approval. I guess my question for you would be, why would you put something into a plan and ask the federal government to approve it and then make further restrictions around how you can change it to requiring federal government approval of something that is a local policy decision?
So here's the reason. That's actually a great question. Is for us, this is our chance to weigh in under our system of governance. This is our chance to weigh in. If we don't include in this amendment the things that have been raised with us and are super, super important to the schools, to the principals, to the teachers, and especially the families that we've talked to, we lose out on their behalf completely. This is our opportunity to put things in there. And I want to say a couple things. We've been through this before. I was in the first round of ESSA, and personnel has changed. So none of this is personal. But the fact is, we were promised that certain adjustments would be made to that original formula, and it never was. Separately, I don't want to speak for him, but I know Representative Patterson has also talked about a similar set of issues with the task force where commitments were made and they weren't met. And again, it's not personal. I'm not saying that these are the personnel that sort of let us down, but at the same time, the personnel could change again. None of us know. So we really, certainly I do, and I feel a number of us feel very, very strongly that we need to get these commitments in there. And you say, well, it's not going to give you a chance to go back at it. Well, from our point of view, we spent a year on this. We've talked to hundreds and hundreds of people. We do feel like we have a good sense of where people are. And for us to drop it and not ask that it be in there, it means that we really forfeit our role as elected representatives trying to reflect the voice of our constituents, and not just our constituents, but our families, our schools. That's our job. So I just want to say that. Thank you.
Yeah, if I could real quick, I think, and Representative Wattenberg, that I came into this position having served 7 years in a very different role, supporting members of a state board, much like yourself. And I will say that your role and your responsibility and your ability to voice and have influence and sway over educational policy is not limited to a single vote. And I truly believe that the relationship and the strength that you and your leadership has built with Superintendent Grant has reflected that, in terms of the fact that you have open dialogue and you have the ability to bring forth initiatives, whether they be formal policy in which you engage with council members, policy in which you bring the state board, you bring panelists and you bring conversation and you bring those questions to Aussie and you advise around a variety of policies, but I think that it would be, I don't think that it would be the best policy to inject something into a plan that requires federal approval with things that are outside the scope of the federal jurisdiction. And I think that you have many different ways and lanes that you can leverage local policy in ways that are outside of a federal state plan.
So I'm just going to say, oh, I wish that it were true, but you know, we live under a set of rules, and the rules are, this is our chance to insist on something. And so I'll just leave it with that.
Thank you very much. Representative Thompson.
Two things that aren't in the amendment currently, or I think aren't in the amendment currently. One, on their final slide, it flags is looking forward to integrating school climate at some point. And so I'm curious what some of the steps look like to see that in the future. Two, I don't think I saw anything around SEL. And I recognize that we currently as a district don't have coherent standards around that. So I don't know how we have metrics if we don't have standards. I would like us to have some standards. But I'm also curious around what some of the steps could be to look at that in the future, especially as we as a district talk a lot about whole child mental health and other supports.
Yeah, I appreciate you raising that awareness so much. I will first address the SEL. One of the things you saw is that we oftentimes see a lot of social emotional learning that takes place in the K-2 area, and thinking about how we currently have the class metric within pre-K, being able to further take time to develop and explore what additional measures could look like in K-2 could very well include some SEL related measures. I also want to thank you for recognizing that without standards, it's very hard to have a strong measurement. But with respect to the school climate, I know that that is something that we've had a task force working on. There's been a lot of work that has been underway in other groups that are thinking about this. I've been very clear about talking about the challenges of integrating something like that into an accountability system, but I've also been very open and willing to the consideration of adding something like that to the report card, recognizing, I'll be honest, it is a thing we hear from every single group that we speak to. Talking with the students about it, I loved their idea of a vibe check. That was something that was great. But thinking about what I hear from parents, what I hear from community, what I hear from all of you, is it something that people want to know? What are others thinking about the school? How satisfied do they feel? What's their level of wellness and well-being? We know that that's measured a variety of ways across our schools. In order to put something like that on our report card, we need to invest and create a DC-wide tool. That's not something that we have right now, but I know that it's something that Aussie is continuing to explore and what that could look like in the future, and definitely integrating something like that once developed onto the report card. And
you mentioned there was a task force working on this.
Task force is a loose form. It's really just as an internal group, an internal Aussie working group to think about how it impacts a variety of different divisions within our agency, and how different agencies have thoughts and ideas around what it can support around social emotional learning and school climate.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. Mm-hmm. I look forward to learning more about their work.
President Sutter to close out. Oh, I apologize. Representative Bernstein.
Hi, sorry for me being tardy.
Hi, Leaf.
Hi, I'm here now. I hope my audio is clear. I had your statement just brought up a quick question for me. And I feel like I should have asked this a long time ago. Does the data that's presented on the report card and in the, does the data presented have to be just taken from the school? Like, does it have to be data that the school collected, or is it like, if we're talking about data about like a vibe check, does that have to be data collected from the school, or can like it be collected by Aussie or by different parties?
Sure, it could be collected by Aussie. When you think about, we've committed to using source level data, And so whether it be our statewide assessments, which we get those scores directly from our test vendor, we think about SATs and AP, we get those directly from College Board. So, if we were to do a DC-wide school climate survey, that is something that Aussie could collect directly. It would not have to come through the schools to Aussie. It could definitely be administered by schools and collected by Aussie.
And that could be something that could potentially happen if there was a vibe check that could be collected outside of schools, right?
I would depend on the structure of the tool. You'd want to check and make sure that you had you'd want to make sure that you had all the precautions in there in terms of having accurate data collection. You wouldn't want to be collecting something from people that might not be students. And so you'd want to have the precautions, whether they took it in school. I think there are probably ways of collecting something like that remotely with a specific login, things like that. But those would all be things to be developed in the development of the tool.
Yeah, not like Google reviews or Yelp or anything. I got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. And sorry again for being.
Thank you. Be safe.
Thank you, Representative Bernstad. All right, Ms. Johnson, I'm going to make one sort of last statement and then yield my time to you in case you have any final statements you'd like to make this evening. So the thing that I hope is clear to the public that I've been trying to keep my eyes on in Aussie's work is that the state board put forth a resolution that included items we wanted to see as part of an Essa Amendment and things that we want Aussie to consider as they design a school report card. This vote we're going to take in July is on the Essa Amendment, and this deck reflects that. Aussie's really focused on growth, really focused on equity in these set of changes in this Essa Amendment, and I really appreciate that. I also want to say, looking at that long-term goal of 81% by 2041, I understand our reason for not changing it, but my goodness, that seems a long way off for our students who aren't achieving that goal yet. And so as we think about schools that aren't hitting the goal, and as we think about the supports we want to provide, I think, and I hope that my colleagues and I can keep our eyes on the prize on that. How do we support our schools in making sure that that 85% can be hit long before 2041? Because some of our schools and some of our students are so far below that now that it's unacceptable, and it's work that we have to do to make sure that they get there. So thank you, and I will turn it to you for any final thoughts you've got.
Thank you so much. I want to take this time to thank all of you. So you guys welcomed me at my second day with Aussie. And on my second day, I came before you, I think it might have been an Essa task force meeting, and presented on the work that I was just learning about with the development of an accountability system and a DC school report card, and how we have grown. And the Aussie team is so strong around this work. I know that Evan Kramer had to jump off, but adding him to our team has truly been a wonderful addition to the work that we do. And having Dr. Grant as our leader now is phenomenal. And I know that you guys are in great hands. And with that, as you can't tell, because I'm rather emotional, but I'm excited to share with you that I have accepted a position with a national education company in which I will be supporting the work of states across the country who are doing this work and building continuous improvement supports for schools and for state agencies, and working directly with policy leaders on improving education policy. And I get to take on the role of being their vice president of strategic partnerships, which is really important. And as you know, I strongly believe the strength of building relationships and building partnerships and how that can be leveraged to improve our educational systems. And so I'm excited about this opportunity to be able to continue that work. But I want to make sure that all of you know that the work that is ongoing by Aussie is truly being driven and supported by Superintendent Grant, and the direction of the path and the plan that we have presented to you is her plan. It is not my plan. I may be the person who has been presenting it to you, but it is Aussie's plan. It is Aussie's commitment. And regardless of whether it's me or Mr. Kramer giving you this presentation, the work and the commitments from Aussie stay strong. And those explanations are consistent about the content and the policy and not a personal position. And so I know that you all continue to do great work. I love the fact that you always ask me the tough questions. I may just tune in at the beginning of July to see if you ask Mr. Kramer the same tough questions. But I also trust that you will grill Mr. Tooley as well. So I appreciate all of the time that you give me. And it has been such a wonderful time. I look forward to my opportunities to come and talk to you. And it's not just because of the affinity I have for state boards over the 7 years before joining Aussie. So I feel like I've gotten to work with state boards for 11 years, not just the 7 before this. So thank you.
Donna, we're so excited for you, and we will obviously miss you terribly, but what a wonderful thing it will be for you to be able to extend your reach, to share your knowledge and your talent for this work with so many folks in other states. So congratulations to you. Thank you for all the time you've given to us. We are honored that we got your last evening with us.
Thank you. And tomorrow is my last day at Aussie.
Excellent.
So for that clarification, I've been keeping this under wraps for a little bit and just not sharing it broadly. So, but yes, tomorrow is my last day in the office.
Well, all the best to you, and your cheer squad in DC will have your back as you move on.
Thank you.
I will share both with you and with Mr. Tooley that as a reminder, all resolutions of the state board must be accompanied by an equity statement and must be reviewed by our student advisory committee. So we'll ask you to please be in touch with the state board staff to arrange for those processes to get underway before our next working session in July. We are very glad to have Mr. Tooley with us this evening. Do we also have Mr. Gall and Mr. Andrew Gall from Aussie to update us on proposed and emergency regulations that would change the district's regulations governing attendance. Gentlemen, who would like to begin?
So that would be me to give you a little bit of framing, and then I will go to Andrew for some of the substance, and then I'll come back at the end. So John Paul, if you want to go to the next slide. All right, so just as a recap, we were here last month to present our concept. And usually on regulatory packages, we come and try to just give you sort of the bare bones sort of skeleton before we give you regulatory language. So this month, we wanted to come back, ground ourselves again in what we're proposing as a concept, but then you should have received in your packet a document that is a marked draft of our proposed and our emergency and proposed rulemaking on this matter of attendance. And we're going to walk through what those components are and where you can find certain pieces of our proposal in the updated rulemaking. You also at your last meeting, and then also in some of the public comment at your public meeting, raised a couple questions about some implications of situation for students with disabilities pertaining to the use of cameras. So we'll give you a little information about that based on our connection with our team that runs special education, that manages special education work. And then two, I think there was a question about home and hospital services, which isn't directly related to this, but I wanted to give you just a little bit of background of how that sort of fits in and be responsive to your questions. And then we'll end with next steps of how we plan to proceed. All right, I will hand it off to one of my deputy chiefs of staff, Andrew Gall, and he will walk you through some of the more substantive work.
Thanks, Justin. And again, we want to thank Donna. The tough shoes to follow, but here just framing the regulatory shift. So the three main parts to the rulemaking. So part one is shifting the definition of present from 80-20 to 60-40. So where is this done? It's done in section 2199, and that's the definition section of chapter 21 of the attendance regulation. And we do this by redefining the terms present, fully absent, and partially absent. The second part of the shift is to just codify parameters for collecting daily attendance in distance learning. Right now, distance learning is an unregulated space. And so that is done by adding new sections for both situational and routine distance learning. You will find those at sections 2101.11 through 2101.18, the last one being 0.18 being for situational. And then the third shift is simply to clean up and clarify unclear and conflicting definitions. I know there was testimony in the public hearing on this topic around some ambiguity in terms of the definitions. So made some definitional shifts in section 2199 and then incorporated those throughout the chapter, in particular by adding the words full day in front of unexcused absences where it's appropriate, and making some other small language changes. Next slide, please. Thanks. We've gone over these, and the next few slides I know we showed to you last time. I know there were a few representatives that were not here, so I wanted to show this to you just in case, but I'll go through this a little bit quickly. I won't read this for you, but there's some specific terms that are used throughout this. So we'll just keep going though. Instructional day. This is outside the scope of the regulatory shift, but is related. In particular, just wanted to point out that we did release our instructional day guidance for the upcoming school year at the end of May. So that is released, and LEAs have access to that, and it includes waivers around situational distance learning. Let's go to the next slide, please. Situational distance learning. So this, by situational distance learning, we mean if there is an emergency, unforeseen circumstance that causes the school to shift from in-person to distance learning instruction. So we've, through our instructional guidance, built in 5 banked distance learning days where schools can make the shift if there is a burst pipe, if there is whatever circumstance that may be unforeseen, but causes the school to need to make that shift. And if there's a need to go beyond 5 days, or if there's a larger citywide emergency, there's also waivers that can be used to go beyond those 5 banked days. Next slide, please. Attendance for routine distance learning. So this is where I mentioned earlier. Right now, there are not regulations that govern this. So I'll slow down a little bit here just to make sure that everybody understands the framework. So for the structure of the instructional day in the distance learning model, we expect LEAs to divide the day into learning modules with certain parameters. So LEAs determine how many modules they will have in a day, the length of those modules, what they will cover. Is it biology? Is it geometry, whatever. The LEA must identify whether the module is synchronous or asynchronous. So is it live, or is it something that is done without the instructor being there speaking to the student? And then at least 1 module per day must be synchronous for every student. For the second part, defining what is being present mean in terms of the instructional day. So being present in synchronous module means that there must be some visual verification, and go into a little bit more in detail later, but there must be some sort of visual ID by the instructor. For asynchronous module, a student must complete an output for the content covered in that module. And then one of our key parameters here was to be counted as present for the day. A student must be marked present in modules that account for at least 60% of the instructional day and must have at least 1 synchronous module. So that is sort of a key that we wanted to incorporate in our regulatory shift that you will see there in the section 21.011 through 21.17. Next slide, please. And here is what it looks like in action. So an example of a distance learning schedule. So you see there are this, if the student was present for the first module, which is synchronous, they're verified by the instructor through a camera being turned on. They're present for the second module, which is asynchronous. They complete their output activity, then they're absent, then they do another asynchronous class where they complete the output. So they're present. So they're present for 3/5 of the day, 60%, and they have done at least one synchronous module. That is the minimum to be counted as present for the day. So they would be counted as present here. That was all shown to you last time, but just wanted to cover that again for those who may have missed it, and just to remind you of sort of the broad parameters which we wanted to codify in our regulation around the distance learning aspect. Next slide, please. So now,
Andrew, can I pause for just a second? So everybody should probably take a look at, be referencing the draft regulation. So I think this is probably might be for some people the first time that we've done this together, a regulatory vote. It's been a little while. So when we issue regulations, we write a preamble to the regulation. So on that first page, you'll see we have to provide a legal justification here. So you'll see the citations that give us the authority to do these things. So that's helpful for you. And then two, you'll see we write narrative. And this is a place where we will document our process. So this process that's ongoing and the feedback that we hear when we go out for a proposed rulemaking. So all of this will be and any changes that the executive branch makes to its rulemaking has to be justified in a preamble. So you'll see in yellow, it says, like, in highlights, you'll see hold for summary of state board. That's where we'll do some of that commentary as we go through the rulemaking process. So there's some places that over time, this will get significantly longer and it goes into the record. So the future Justin and Andrews will be like, so what did Aussie do in 2022 when we did the attendance regulation? And they'll have something to at least look by to memorialize the process. So this is very, very helpful to government bureaucrats. So super helpful. And then when you get into on page 3, you'll start to see the text of the regulation. And so Andrew is going to walk you through where you will see the changes of our proposal to the rulemaking. All right, I'll go back to Andrew now.
Thanks, Justin, for that context. Definitely helpful. Yes, so I wanted to just identify any substantive changes. There were also some changes, adding a comma here, but didn't want to overload you, but pulled out the substantive ones that I believe are of most interest to you. So starting here at section 2101 around reporting. So currently in 2101.7, Aussie is prior to the beginning of each school year, Aussie shall issue a report including the following information: truancy rates for each educational institution. This changes that to by November 30th of each year, Aussie shall issue a report related to truancy rates and chronic absentee rates. So 2 shifts here. One is the date. So right now, beginning of school, each school year is an ambiguous term, and we try to avoid those types of ambiguities in the law, especially because there is one school in the district, I'm forgetting their name right now, but that begins crazy early. So what does beginning of each school year mean? It's a bit of ambiguous. Also, the statute says by November 30th, so we're just aligning to what the statute says. And then secondly, we're adding chronic absenteeism. We report on that already, so this is just sort of putting into the regulation what our practice is. 2101.9 requires schools to send a letter to Aussie and to parents notifying a student of 10th absence. We're just adding full day before unexcused absence for clarity. Next, please. Here is the new information around distance learning. So 2101.11 through 0.18. So this is where we are writing all those framing the slides that we showed you earlier, what we are doing to actually codify that. So if you look at 2101.11, it requires schools offering distance learning to submit an attendance plan to Aussie that complies with the instructional day. So 180 days, 6 hours requirement, identifies whether class will be synchronous or asynchronous, has at least one synchronous class per day, as noted in our framing slide, preserves attendance records, communicates attendance expectations, including regarding supervision to parents. So all those things should be included in the attendance plan that schools that want to offer distance learning will submit to Aussie. On 2101.12, we define presence for synchronous modules, and if you look at the text, it says camera temporarily on to verify student. So this, we added the word temporarily because I know Representative Gasoy and Representative Bernstead last time had raised questions around whether it was appropriate for students with disabilities to have the camera on the whole time. So we spoke to our special education experts here at Aussie, and they agreed that it could be a problem for students to expect the camera to remain on for the entire class for certain students with disabilities. So we added that word temporarily to really address that need. On 2101.13, we define presence in asynchronous module. A student must complete an output, and then I know there was, I believe it was Representative O'Leary and some of our other stakeholders had raised the question of what that means exactly. So we sort of turned it up a little bit in terms of how we're defining output. So if you look in the definitions in 2199, we make that more clear, but we mean like an instructional activity. And if you look at 2199, it puts that more finely. 2101.14 through 17 defines presence for attendance and routine distance learning consistently with the new 60/40 rule. So this is where for distance, we want to make sure that we're having the same expectations as in person in terms of the amount of presence that a student needs to maintain. So that 60/40 rule, and it requires the student to attend at least one synchronous module daily to be marked present. And 2101.18 is the part where we codify our plan around situational distance learning. So in terms of attendance procedures. So within broad parameters, LEAs get to define it. So specifically, they must have one-on-one contact. The LEA can define that, whether it's a phone call, whether it's through a camera on, that's left a little bit broader for situational distance, and the completion of an instructional activity. So that is our distance learning attendance new regulation provisions. Next slide, please. Okay, 2103.2 C3 defines when a student should be referred to SS. This whole slide, actually, really what we're doing is just adding the word full day in front of unexcused absence. So whether we're talking about referring students to SST for absences, whether we're talking about SST reporting the 10th absence to their school administrator, and whether they're talking about school referrals to district agencies. We're just clarifying and saying that this should be a full day unexcused absence. So one of the reasons for the shift behind 60/40 that we heard is that SST teams are overburdened and they want to focus on students that they actually are missing the entire day, that they don't know that they where they are, right? That we want to focus on the students who have real truancy needs. And so just clarifying that we are speaking about full day unexcused absences will allow that greater resource focus on students who are not showing up at all. So that's the change that you will see there at 2103. Next slide, please. And then 2199, this is the definitions section for chapter 21. So currently, you will see present includes being there 80% of the day. So this is where the 80-20 rule comes from. And then our proposed change is to say a school day when the student is either fully present or partially present is what present means. So fully present 100% of the day, partially present is 60% of the day. So that's where we're shifting from that 80-20 to the 60-40. In person, this is just a shift that to reduce ambiguity. Right now it says student is physically present in the educational institution, just adding or at the specified offsite in-person location, because students may be at an internship or at a college institute of higher education through dual enrollment or offsite at the ATC. So this was simply to clarify that if you are taking a class at Trinity through doing dual enrollment, that still counts as being in person, and you would be present there. Next slide, please. And I won't go through all of these, but we also added additional definitions in this section. So asynchronous, fully absent, module, output, partially absent, the rest, and removed some definitions that were unneeded in the regulation. So this is the major substantive changes in the regulation as we have written it currently, and I'm happy to, well, kick it back to Justin for to wrap up.
Thanks, Andrew. So Andrew will be a face that you all will see often. Andrew has been here for not 3 months yet, but he's getting the state board appearances in early. So we're glad he's on our team. Next slide. Okay. So Andrew spoke a little bit about the students with disabilities question. So we did make that clear that that's temporarily turning on the camera. And I think that was very helpful, a helpful flag to raise that the board raised. We are not compelled to completely get rid of the camera component. We want to be very clear about that. We do believe that at least once per day that a school needs to have some sort of eye contact on a student to make sure that it's also a wellness check. So we wanted to be in accordance with the law, but we still do not want to sacrifice this piece of making sure that there's some sort of visual wellness check for students. This other question about home and hospital instruction. So this is a little bit of a longer answer, so bear with me a little bit. So some of you may remember a few years ago, the council passed legislation on home and hospital instruction. So that law was the Students' Right to Home or Hospital Instruction Act of 2020. And broadly, what that law did is it required schools to adopt and implement a home and hospital instruction program that provides academic instruction and support to students who have been or will be absent from their school of enrollment for 10 or more consecutive or cumulative school days due to a health condition. So that's straight from the summary of the legislation. And it also requires us to propose regulations about how students can have access to this, what happens if an LEA denies it, and an appeals process. Aussie is behind on codifying this regulation, but we're working on this regulation in accordance with the law because it does require us to issue regulations. So generally how this works is that sometimes students can have some sort of condition to where, like if they break a leg and for a little while they can't come to school, or some other sort of health condition that a doctor diagnoses and says that they are unable to come physically into the school building. And then some kids are very, very sick and to get education or in the hospital, like these type of educational services are pretty common. So what the student does is they complete a medical certification of need. And that's a written statement signed by a licensed physician, a nurse practitioner, could be a clinical psychologist, mental health counselor, therapist, or physician's assistant that outlines and certifies the diagnosis, contains a recommendation from that medical practitioner. It states the anticipated duration of the student's health condition, and it states whether the student's health condition is anticipated to be continuous, partial, or intermittent. So sometimes kids maybe have to do a treatment, come back, or then go back for treatment. So it gives that level of detail. So our rulemaking around this will not place any restrictions on the use of distance learning to provide this service. It's important that educational continuity is fulfilled when students are sick. And sometimes an LEA might do it to where an instructor comes to the student. For some students, that may be very, very appropriate for them, depending on what setting they're in or what their condition is. But for some students, that might not be the case. And because we're more in a sort of an innovative space around distance learning, we are not requiring in-person instruction to be the only way that this happens. It also helps LEAs and schools provide the benefit more efficiently and effectively to students. So what our rulemaking at this time, and it's still in draft, and we're working through our sort of drafting process, is that it's up to the parent about how they want these services provided. Like, it can be in person unless they use some sort of computer or functionality. So it gives that sort of opportunity for families and LEAs to do that. I will pause there, and Andrew and I will take additional questions. We might want to. I've got my notes, and I think maybe we can do this from.
Thank you very much, both of you. Really appreciate you being here. Members, we will follow the same procedure. Please use the raise your hand features, and I'll call you in order. We'll start with Representative Bernstein.
Hi. So I appreciate the addition to the word temporarily in section 210111. I just wanted to clarify, this is applicable for all students, or is this part of, like, if you have an individualized education plan that says that this is accommodation you can have?
It would be for all students that are utilizing full distance learning in a distance learning school. It would apply to all students. It's not a specific carve out for a group of students. Okay, great. That 30 seconds, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Representative Johnson.
Hello, Mr. Tooley and Mr. Gull. Thank you so much for joining us. I just had a quick question for clarification. So I know that when we received report cards and like progress reports, they would tell us about our attendance and the number of days that we were absent or may have missed. So my question for you both today is, now that they're differentiating the terms of partially absent and being partially present, how will that accommodate on report cards and progress reports in the future?
It's a really, really good question. I remember getting those, but I was afraid of tardies. Sometimes didn't like to go on time, but yeah, don't tell my mom, but she saw it. But so report cards and grade cards and things those look very differently across LEAs and schools. So that is providing information back to families and students in the way that sort of matches the school's instructional model or the courses they teach or different grade scales. We don't put parameters around how that is displayed back to families. How LEAs and schools share that information back on report cards would be up to them.
Okay. Thank you so much. I yield the rest of my time.
Thank you very much. Representative O'Leary.
Good evening, both of you.
Hello. Evening.
I have a question that we've talked about, Mr. Tooley, you and I for many times. I'm wondering about, I've heard a lot from teachers this year about students who get to class right before the end of class and are counted as present. With these new rules that you got here, is there and you can say Aussie isn't in charge of it, and that's fine, but do the LEAs control how they choose a student being tardy or present or absent?
Right. So one thing we're trying to do with our distance learning regulations is, so you will see a significant difference, and Dr. O'Leary, and I think this has come from some of your feedback over time, is so in situational distance, which is used very it is very different from the rules around full distance learning. So we have a higher bar for full distance learning that says, hey, no, we need you to be the full 6 hours
Right.
per day. We need you to do the outputs and things. So that's higher than what we were doing very early in the pandemic with everybody. And that was, I think that's where we started this engagement around this question. Tardies, we do not keep track of. We do not keep track of tardies, what constitutes a tardy. That is an LEA and school decision.
Okay.
Yes.
That's a big help because it's a real problem, but I understand it's not your problem. And the distance and the fact that I know this is a distance learning regulations kind of thing, and that's very helpful because maybe I'm a little more strict as far as I would concern. I'd rather see the student all the time in the class anyway. But
so would I. But I would say also, Dr. O'Leary, is again, executive agencies like Aussie, we are constrained by the statute. And I would argue that physical presence is sort of the inside outdoors of the building and not within the building so much in our attendance statutes. So reaching in and sort of like doing a whole bunch of regulations around tardies might be not exactly within what the statute allows us to do.
No, I understand. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Representative Reed.
Good evening. I should have wrote down the section, but it was related to the situational, I think the situational distance learning. And it relates to the one-on-one and the instructional component. Is that the school level or student level? So is that like the student has to do situational one day, or is that like the school has a busted pipe and has to do situational on a day?
Got it. Good. Great question. So this has to do with our instructional day guidance. And that 5 bank days is for a full school conversion, right? That we will let the school go from full school for 5 times. But if let's say there are quarantine situations, we are not regulating individual classrooms. Our goal is to keep the schools open as much as possible. And through Omicron, we were really successful in doing that because we were allowing schools, hey, if a classroom needs to go offline and convert to situational, they would do that. They would follow the attendance rules around the situational piece by the classroom, but that wouldn't count as the 5 days for a full school situation. So we're trying to give schools the flexibility. So when their entire school needs to close down for whatever reason, they can do that without putting any type of request into me. They need to track their data systems. They need to tell us, and we'll monitor them towards the 5 days. And then we didn't want to make that too high because we want to prioritize in-person learning and we want kids inside of the building, but we wanted to provide that flexibility.
So that one-to-one component is related to communication that, hey, Justin, school is closed today, and that can be a phone call, a text, more than the instruction piece.
Correct. Like it is. So for a full distance learning school, it's a much higher bar for what constitutes presence. But for situational distance, which we are trying to guard against the use of it, but provide schools with the opportunity to use it when they need it, it is the 2-part test. So it is, you need to have contact with the student somehow. You pick how that works for your kids. And then you need to do, there needs to be some sort of output in that. For situations.
I'm just asking all these little random questions. It just has to be the attempt. So it could
no, it is not. It should not be. They need to make contact. It would be like me saying, Carlene Reed here, present. Like, no, I need your contact. It's not just an attempt. No. Okay. And if there's ambiguity there, Andrew, we should make that a little bit more clear. Thank you. Very helpful.
Thank you very much. Representative Lopez.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. So I have 2 quick questions. And the first one goes back to the new section 2101.11. And I just want to clarify so that I understand well the wording of that section. So it says that requires schools offering distance learning to submit an attendance plan to Aussie. And then the second to last bullet point says preserves attendance records. So that is, the submission of the plan would have to be made by the school, or will will there be a plan that is for all schools that will then be submitted to Aussie?
No. So what we're referring to here is that so you may go to DCP if you go to, I'm not quite sure where you go to school, but if you go to a KIPP high school, you're in KIPP's LEA. And if you go to Cardozo High School, you're in DCPS. So DCPS would provide those plans of how they were doing it in their individual school. And then we require DCPS or KIPP, they need to preserve their attendance records. So in case somebody had a question, we could come back and audit them and check them. That's what we're saying there. So there could be different plans in different. You could go to DCPS, you could go to Friendship. Those plans could be different, but they could still both beat our bar.
Okay.
Representative Lopez, I think your sound went out. Representative Lopez?
I saw my connection went out.
Uh-oh.
We can hear you now. Go ahead and ask your next question.
Thank you. So my second question, was around communication to the new changes and the way that we're communicating this to students. So I know that there are some students who, as of now, don't really know the full way that attendance is working right now. And are there any plans as to how you're communicating this to students and then families in general?
Mm-hmm. Great question. So there are places in the rulemaking about you have to provide sort of your attendance policy. This was existing rules that schools have to provide that information. Also for distance learning schools, we are saying, hey, you need to provide us with how you're telling families how this works and what their expectation is. So usually attendance things are covered in like school student handbooks and attendance codes of conducts and things like that. That would still continue.
And I'll just add that I know I've talked with the ombudsman for DC, and they have outreach to parents, and they are going to put in their newsletter around the change. There are other entities like the Everyday Counts Committee that also has interactions with parents and have expressed a desire to help make sure that parents understand the shifts here as well.
And then too, when you start missing school a lot, the rules, the law, and this regulation requires certain agencies to reach out to families, certain actors to reach out to families. So if you miss a certain number of days, you get this packet of like, hey, your kid misses too much school, and here's a whole bunch of resources to help you, and here's what the law is and all the things. And then if you miss more and more school, you could potentially start hearing from other agencies.
Thank you. I'm out of time.
Thank you very much. Representative Thompson.
Good evening. I am again excited that we're making these very necessary changes and expanding, just having some criteria for virtual instruction. I am curious. We got really good feedback from our colleagues and our student reps at the last session where you presented, and I'm super grateful to see those changes reflected. I'm curious for others who have feedback beyond just us as representatives, what is the best way for them to communicate that, given, we're on this tight timeline to get this implemented for the start of the school year?
Right. Yes. So many ways is like, it depends. Like if we're talking about like advocacy communities, Andrew sits on the Everyday Counts Task Force. We've talked about this with them. We've also done some engagement around with different government agencies to make sure that they know what we're doing. As far as like individual stakeholder feedback, one way to do that is that, remember, all of our proposed rulemaking have to go through notice and comment for at least 30 days. And so that would be one way for them to, so that is how the public gives us feedback on regulations. And then we have to respond back to, did you take that feedback? Why or why not? And that goes in this preamble. So we inventory all of that, and then we add how we make any of those changes, why or why not, and document those things.
So essentially your answer is they should weigh in during the notice and comment period?
Correct.
Okay. And then I'm assuming that as members, if we receive feedback, we can just pass it on to you or to Andrew.
You should do that anytime. Yes.
Oh, of course. But, I mean, I literally have had some parents weigh in and who are really looking forward to this. In addition, like I had someone reach out to me last week and say, hey, I'm really excited about this. And they're a high school parent and they had feedback, but they weren't quite sure where to find the materials or like what's the latest and greatest version and when to weigh in. So I want to be as clear as possible with people about how they get their feedback heard.
We will make that very clear when we go and file and put it in the register, and how to make that stuff available to you through the state board staff. And also too, when you do notice and comment, it doesn't just have to be bad things. If they agree with us, they can also say that we love saying commenters agreed. So that is very helpful too.
Yes, I'm aware.
Thank you very much. President Sutter.
Thank you both for the presentation and for clearly walking us through the changes in each part of the regulations. I'm curious, you talked a little bit about the feedback that we offered and the way the changes are reflected, and I really echo Vice President Thompson. I appreciate that very much. I'm curious if you got feedback from any of your Aussie stakeholder groups, the principal committee or LEA leaders, and what kind of feedback they've offered so far.
Andrew, do you want to take some of this, and then I can fill in what we fill in gaps?
Sure.
I gotta do better delegating.
So there was extensive feedback from multiple sessions with LEA leaders. We presented the slide deck rather than the language that you have before us. So when we were sort of getting our ideas tightened around how to what our parameters should be for distance learning, that was where we received a lot of feedback from LEA stakeholders and school leaders in particular. For example, we initially had an expectation that we wanted to nail down to schools could not have programs within. They would need to be a separate school if they were going to be a distance learning, and we moved away from that based upon feedback that we received from LEA leaders. There's a number of other pieces of feedback that we received. But that was just one example. Justin, I'm sure you can give more context there.
So, I mean, remember, we had a hearing on this, and we've had a hearing on legislation that changed the definition of present, and we heard a lot of feedback then. And a lot of that is here, especially it was particularly helpful feedback on some of these technical changes that we made about clarifying full day absences and just doing a better job of writing the regulation. This regulation was kind of old. The other thing that we did was we do have distance learning school institutions, and we did a special setup with those schools that were already offering it and that might potentially be thinking about it. And our initial concepts were way more rigid about making the instructional day sort of fit, like making the traditional schedule look the same in distance. So really just pulling the in-person and putting in distance. And we heard a lot of feedback about that. And we've also learned that some people are doing it differently. One school's setup is very different from another school's setup, but there were ways where they could both work. And so we went back to what are the non-negotiables, right? So the non-negotiables were, you got to go to school 180 days, 6 hours per day. You got to check attendance. You got to follow the 60-40 rule. We wanted to see your physical presence. We wanted to see the student's identity for welfare, and we wanted to make sure that there was some sort of in asynchronous learning. We know both schools use synchronous and asynchronous. They decide how they set that up, but we wanted to make sure that there were some guardrails about what you do in synchronous and asynchronous that weren't burdensome, allowed innovation to happen, but really stayed with, hey, we wanted to make sure that kids were getting what we pay for as taxpayers of the instructional day and the instructional services.
Thank you very much to both of you.
Members, we are now on second round. Are there anyone with second round questions? Representative Bernstein.
I just had one more question, and this is just to make sure. So, okay, I want to word this in the way that is concise. I don't know if I can. Hybrid learning, is that, or do students have to be either one or the other, fully virtual or in person in a hybrid school? Can there be days in a hybrid school that are not situational, that are like planned out? Like, for instance, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, we're in person, and then Wednesday, we're distance learning, or we're doing asynchronous and some synchronous work? Or does it have to be kind of the set structured where you're either in person or online?
Okay, so let's be clear on, and Andrew, you can pop in here and make sure I don't butcher this one. So let's be clear about hybrid learning. Like, that is a school's model as hybrid. Like, it's not, I'm going to just use an example. It's not like your 2 days telework day. Like, it could be, but it needs to be a part of your consistent school's model. It can't just be like you did it this week and then you didn't go back to it this week. Maybe in the workforce later on in life, but not for school. And there are some schools that are moving to, or interested in moving, or already have some sort of hybrid model. And we wanted to make sure that for those schools, there's a few public charter schools, and they have to be, by their authorizer, the Public Charter School Board, they have to be approved for that model. You just can't go do it on your own. And so on the days that they're in person, they will follow our in-person attendance policy. On the days that they are distance, they will follow our distance. And then, but most schools will stay in person. But we are sort of allowing that innovation to happen, because it's kind of an exciting place. But what we care about is that in both settings, that we get good information on attendance, and we can make sure that kids are coming to school and where we expect them to be and learning.
So it's more about consistency and I think that's what I'm asking. Like, if a school decides to ask or gets approved for a schedule, the definition of hybrid is just a combination of in-person and online. It doesn't need to be like students are 100% in person or 100% online all the time, as long as it's consistent.
Right. So if you look at the regulation 2101.11 through 0.17, where it talks about regular or otherwise routine basis, that would cover full-time virtual as well as the hybrid piece that you were talking about.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Members, I don't see any other hands for second round, so I'll turn it to President Sutter to close.
Oh, can we do one more slide to just give timeline of what we're going to do next?
Yeah, that'd be great. That's a good way to end it.
Right. All right. John Paul, will you go back to the slides? I think I can do it from memory, but I can do it from memory. Don't worry about it, man. All right. So here we go. All right, so it's June, and we've delivered our emergency and proposed rulemaking to you. In July, we will come back. We will come back with another presentation. We will answer any questions that you have. We will also have our resolution. We will follow the state board's procedures about issuing those resolutions, and we will seek your approval through of that resolution. As soon as we do that, we will move to our process for promulgating regulations. So we are going to go for an emergency and proposed rulemaking. So the superintendent has the power to lay down an emergency for a number of days to get the school year started. And then we'll go through the administrative procedure to do the proposed rulemaking and the 30-day comment period, and then go to a final rulemaking. If we heard, I mean, this is always a question that we answer when we do this, is like, what if something changes? Like, if there is a significant change, there are rules on executive agencies that make us go back and do proposed rulemaking again. So I can't just say, oh, here's our proposed rulemaking, I got a whole comment, and now I'm going to go final rulemaking it look completely different. And if we had those substantive changes, something that triggered a substantive change, we would also come back to you all for that. Usually doesn't happen, but sometimes it can. I don't anticipate it happening in this situation, but that's how that process works. And then we will move towards our final rulemaking. In the meantime, though, we will issue a whole lot of guidance around how you implement our attendance guidance. We'll do that through technical guidance around like attendance codes. We'll do this through sort of making this into sort of a more user-friendly FAQ document for LEAs and schools to access and make it easier about their obligations. We'll also set up places for them to come learn about the rules, and they can ask us questions if they need more additional technical support and assistance. So that's the work that an administrative agency does in making sure that people understand the laws and regulations. Yeah, so.
All right. Well, we very much appreciate the presentation tonight and the clarity on the kinds of comments and questions we asked last time being reflected here. So thank you very much for that. We look forward to seeing the proposed and emergency rule making on regulation on our agenda next month. And I'll provide the same reminder that I did around accountability, which is that our board requires an equity statement and review by the Student Advisory Committee prior to our vote, so that SBOE staff can help ensure that these requirements are completed in a timely fashion, and that we get what we need from our students to move things to a vote.
All right, we will comply.
All right. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
All right.
Have a nice
Bye-bye.
week. All right, members, we are done with external presentations. We're going to move to a couple of internal business matters, starting with sexual assault and moving on to our committee reports. And then we have one more large item on our agenda tonight. So moving to sexual assault in schools. We've all heard disturbing reports of sexual assaults in our schools. And Representative Reed has been at the forefront of making sure that the board has kept our eye on this, especially from her leadership of advocacy and outreach. So Representative Reed, we'd like to turn to you for a chance to hear from you on the current status of the discussion the A&O committee had last week about this topic.
Sure. And I have 6 slides so I can kind of make sure I stay on topic. Can I share my screen?
Mr. Hayworth, are you able to facilitate that? There we go.
Thank you. Wait. There you go. Okay. Share and slideshow and go back to the beginning. Okay. Can everyone see? Cool. So yes, I think President Sutter has started us off with essentially what the topic is, some background. I say March 2020. I was just throwing these together. March 2022, there have been several instances of sexual reports or allegations of sexual assault and misconduct. I know, trigger warning, I'm not gonna get into detail, but I know Representative Chang had an instance at a Ward 2 school that really, or came down to an arrest. I know I had a situation in Ward 8 that really kind of scared community members because of lack of information about what was going on. And then there was also a report of like a inappropriate relationship between the staff and students. So, and this is since March 2022 that we're aware of. So we've been talking as an outreach and advocacy committee about, and I think it's on our work plan, to address the issue. And essentially what happened? I drafted a resolution based on what was kind of talking to Representative Chang first, because him and his council member put together like a letter that went out to folks that also spoke to Representative Chang, not last Friday, the Friday before last, to get what his perspective was on, based on all the things that he just knew about his concern, what was going on. And then I kind of told him about what was going on my end. And essentially we kind of just jotted down some ideas and kind of came with like the intent of this resolution is to make our city agencies aware that, we as SBOE members have received reports of sexual assault or abuse or misconduct, remind agencies of the consistency in handling processes. That was a really big one for Representative Chang. He felt like we were not shy in protocol, but how consistent that was followed was where he would say he would lean in for his circumstance. And then families and communities are made aware when these allegations are made. Kind of stemming off of what I encountered was it spread like a wildfire on social media. In ward members or members in our ward, and then no one could really pinpoint of like what's actually happening. So this is kind of like preliminary purposes of our resolution. I say preliminary because we had a robust discussion as outreach and advocacy members related to the draft resolution that I just kind of tinkered up based on the information that I had and what I discussed with Representative Chang. What did I do? Sorry, some key points that are just in there, but when I was talking to outreach and advocacy committee.
Can I pause just 1 second, Representative Reed? So I just want to voice over for the public that these slides are not posted, but we will make sure they are posted. Is there a draft of the resolution that is posted anywhere? I know that we have exchanged some internal emails about it, but
I'm not sure. It was some back and forth about what should we share, what should we not share. I know I don't mind what we currently have sharing with folks, but understanding that like we're also building upon this and members of the public can chime in on like, does this even meet your needs? Or do you have more? So we can, yes, push out the draft.
Okay. I'll hold till the rest of the discussion period for members. I'm just want to make sure that the public is aware that there's nowhere they should be looking for this at the moment because this is not posted.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. Because I wasn't sure when we said like we'll add it to the agenda, if it were just talking about the topic or the draft resolution. So won't get too into like exactly what, but kind of key things were pushing agencies to consistently follow processes, act expeditiously to investigate, consider methods for expediting preliminary communications. And I raised that because in the investigation, there was a long lapse between what was going on. And it just might be helpful for like even preliminary communications to say like, hey, we are investigating this. Just so community is aware of, we're on like, somebody knows that people are on top of it and looking for it. Regular trainings and other related topics such as like Title IX was something that emerged in Representative Chang's situation related to like coordinators and mandated reporting requirements. Other possible things are like frontline supports and communities are aware of the procedures for reporting. Not necessarily related to sexual assault, but like another instance where ANC reported that a child, may have gotten hurt in school or something like that. Sometimes people are reporting it to, they're not using the right processes. And it's also causing a delay. But also making sure that, if council members' offices, community organizations are just aware of, if you ever encounter this, this is kind of how you proceed. Other areas of innovation, such as anonymous reporting, like can we use apps or technological solutions or other mechanisms for students to voice what might be happening or make a note. And then possible wraparound services such as can we expedite placements to another school, mental health supports, other wellness provisions. So that was kind of preliminary. As the Outreach and Advocacy Committee discussed, they were like, hey, there's a lot of emphasis on reporting, but can we really lean into what are the other, are there other areas, ideas, things that we need to be doing around the issue? Specifically, I think I heard members of the committee mention being proactive or preventive measures to be added. So what came out of our robust discussion was hosting a roundtable with our sister agencies, such as the Student Advocate, Ombudsman, who have some expertise in the area, DCPS, maybe any Title IX folks, or whoever the office is related to it, the DME, of course, our SAC, SBOE, going to our SAC to get information. Of course, as Representative Sutter has said over and over tonight, we have to get feedback from our Student Advisory Council on anything that we're moving through. Also, a plug, we also need to come to our Student Advisory Council related to bullying, was something else that emerged later on meeting, different topic. And I know your next meeting is June 13th, but whenever you have space, just let us know. Finalize resolution based on feedback, and draft any accompanying equity statement. I literally typed that while sitting here because I realized that was, I keep forgetting all our lovely processes related to drafting a resolution, but we need to have an equity statement that accompanies it. And then determine, we know, resolution is something that is in our wheelhouse to do and act on, but are there any additional steps, or how do we follow up on the topic? And then we also know often we, when we do our resolutions, we often have, especially in outreach and advocacy, we have a follow-up section where we're like, did we fully address or put a bow where we could on an issue? So that's kind of, I think that's it. Next steps with the issue is, how do I stop sharing? There we go. Any members from the outreach and advocacy, since it was a very robust topic, have want to chime in about the issue? If not, I'm not sure we're doing the time if members want to chime in on the topic as well.
If there are members of advocacy and outreach you want to add in, we can do that. Otherwise, we can go to questions from members for Dr. Reed.
Okay, so the floor is open. I see Representative Wattenberg.
Hi, so this is all very, I think these are all the right directions. My question is really, can you say more both to the public and to us? And then I wonder if it should also be in the resolution, what has led you and us to this point? In other words, are there processes that aren't being observed? Are there no processes? Sort of how broad, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think I might have skirted over that a little bit. So in Representative Chang's case, it seemed like protocols in place, but the consistency is what he really leaned in on, how that was followed over the years. For the situation that I was aware of in Ward 8, the incident with the police report happened March 15th. The parents did not receive a letter until March 22nd that something happened. Meanwhile, in between that, on I think March 20th, a community member had got on I think Facebook Live and was saying like, this issue is not being elevated, which sparked like about 2 days of people really just kind of figuring out what was going on. The way that it was presented, we couldn't figure out if it was one instance, multiple instances, because it was just a long time of community members going without notice. So when we kind of drilled down, it seemed like there was just a lapse in when the community received information. And understand that sometimes you have to do an investigation and get more information. But I think a recommendation that I put in the draft was like, could there even be preliminary communications that says like, hey, we are investigating something, just so that parents can, maybe have a conversation with their student, be on alert, and not the 800 views later on a social media post, which I'm glad the community member, elevated that through a variety of channels. But it was one, knowing the topic is very triggering for community members to have to encounter that. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Well, the only comment I'll make is this is all very sensitive. So how it gets said, I get is not easy. I do think there needs to be a setup for it. Why are we raising this? So I'm just going to say that.
Thank you.
But I think it's very important to be involved, and I appreciate that you've gone to this effort to pull it together, and I look forward to hearing what comes up at the other sessions.
Thanks, Representative Wattenberg. It looks like Vice President Thompson has her hand up.
A couple thoughts. So Representative Wattenberg's question, I think is a helpful one because we had a robust conversation at the Advocacy and Outreach Committee around just like what's currently in place, like where are there gaps in policy, where's there a lack of consistency in implementation, and what is it that and where are our gaps as members in understanding what those policies and protocols are, this is one of the reasons that the roundtable idea came up. I really appreciate that Representative Reed and Representative Chang have started to put some thoughts into action. And we, as we talked about it more, and of course, all of our meetings are recorded, but as we talked about it more, we realized that there were a couple of places that we had questions around, and we also had resources around. So one of the next steps for the Advocacy and Outreach Committee, as I understood it, was actually, in addition to the roundtable, was also just to seek some guidance from our sister offices, both the Ombudsman and the Student Advocate, because they, of course, are dealing with a bunch of issues across LEAs, know the lay of the land, and can help us think about like what are the calls to action, who exactly we need to ask for what in a way to move this forward that not just raises awareness of the issue, but that hopefully results in some action. And so I really look forward to the roundtable. Our hope is that it will be something that kind of crosses agencies and stakeholders, so we can continue to learn and elevate learnings around the issue and opportunities and also challenges, so that when we do put forth a full resolution, and I know that members of the board, some of this may be the first time you're saying this, so I know this is an opportunity for us at this meeting to say, yes, like we're aware, please be paying attention to this. You all are invited to attend the roundtable as we start this thinking, and we welcome your feedback on like what questions to ask and what actions to take, because this is not a Ward 8 or a Ward 2 only issue. This is a citywide issue, and we want to be really both thoughtful and sensitive to the issue, but also responsive. And so I just wanted to kind of, as I'm listening and hearing the questions, layer on that we did have a really long, complicated conversation around this. And we are hoping to bring more members and more expertise into this conversation.
Thank you, Representative or Vice President Thompson. And I guess I just have to ask if folks can just put in the chat dates that absolutely, I'm not sure, absolutely do not work for you. I think that's easier to ask, so that, because my plan is for this week, we want to start getting those coordinating sister agency times and think about scheduling. So if folks can put in the chat times that actually don't work for you, that would be great. That's all I got.
Thanks, Representative Reed. I appreciate this as well, and I'm excited about this idea of a roundtable, because I know one of the thoughts that I had about this topic, even the first time I think Representative Chang raised it, is that there seems to be a need for information, like data, on this question of what is happening. And we are hearing about some incidents, but I think there, for me, is a gap in like what is the situation in DC. I did a little diving in. I was traveling for work last week when this discussion was taking place, so I was looking at what's happening in New York. New York has recently settled some lawsuits related to sexual assaults in schools and has some very interesting sort of outcomes from that process, but they also seem to have a lot of data. So for me, one of the questions I hope we can get someone on the roundtable to share with us is more information on what do we know, what don't we know, what is the universe of what is possible to learn about this, so that we can think about what kind of response might be needed and what the role for the board might be in the work. Thank you for the update. Looks like there's some conversation getting started about how to schedule this roundtable, and I know board members will provide input so that we can get that scheduled, and then we can announce to the public when it will happen. We can also talk about posting items before and after that roundtable as appropriate. So thank you very much, Dr. Reed, for tonight. We are going to move on to committee reports, and as we noted in an email to members before this working session, we're going to try a slightly different approach to working session committee reports. Each committee chair or co-chairs will have 2 minutes to quickly report on their activities this month. And then we'll do like a lightning round, 2 minutes max for questions for the chair. Members of the public who may still be watching or who may watch this recording later, I encourage you all to review the committee reports, which are posted on our website, which have much more substantive information about what committees are working on and what they accomplished at meetings over the past month since our last working session. So I will turn first for our 2-minute update to the Student Advisory Committee.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a really short report. Student Advisory Committee met twice during the month of May. The first time that we met was May 9th, and we talked about the SAC annual report. And then the second time that the SAC met was May 23rd, and we had a 2-part discussion. So first we had Ms. Miranda and Mr. Ju come and talk about the Education Standards Committee and about a panel that was being hosted on student voice in education. So we brainstormed some questions that could be asked to the group of panelists from other states around student voice in education and how to make sure that we're uplifting the student voice. And then we shifted back to the annual report conversation. So we're currently working on the draft for the annual report, and we hope to finalize it soon so that we can share the rest, so that we can share the first draft with the SAC and make the final revisions to be done with the annual report. And that is it.
Thank you, Representative Lopez. Any questions for the Student Advisory Committee? Love it. Moving along, we'll come to accountability and assessment.
Sorry about that. Thank you. So I'm going to actually start with our well-rounded education research. We, as I think mentioned at earlier meetings, we have decided to put that research off until the next fiscal year so that we can engage a third-party vendor with the funding that we need. But we did also decide to hopefully have staff help us do some preliminary research, which will just be like a brief survey of existing research on this topic so that we get a sense of methodology that we could use in our proposal. So I just wanted to start with that because the more relevant one to tonight, obviously we had a longer conversation about the accountability framework and the resolution in relation to the amendment. And I think something that has come up tonight is that they're hard to reconcile because I think, you know, to our credit, we came up with a resolution that really fundamentally rethinks how we would do assessment of our schools, and it doesn't fit entirely with how the current bureaucracy allows or is handling it. So I think that, you know, one of the things we grappled with is the fact that because we're only or Aussie is only working on the amendment, really our recommendations will not come up until later. And we won't, most of us will be off the board by the time you vote on it. And so if that is something before I set up, I will just say, I do want to thank Representative Wattenberg for bringing up sort of that piece of it that we're grappling with, that on the one hand, we really do have responsibility to all of those folks we engaged, to our schools, to, you know, the work that we've done to ourselves, to carry this work through and to do it in a way that, you know, is, I guess, feasible within this framework or this this method that's being used. So that's what we're grappling with. That's what we talked about. And so one of the things that I'm hoping is that our committee can help come up with a way forward. We have 1 month now before Aussie provides us with the final draft. And so I think our responsibility really is to be really clear with them about what we are hoping and expecting for that final resolution. Amendment. Please excuse me.
Yeah. Thank
And
you,
I think that's it.
And thanks for being with us. I know it's a long meeting already. It's a longer meeting still when you're not at 100%. Are there questions for Representative Gasoy? All right. Thank you, Representative Gasoy. Administrative Committee.
Okay, headlines. We're getting the owl. We made that decision at the admin committee. Thank you all for bearing with us and like borrowing Aussie's equipment, trying it out. It seemed to work fairly well so that people can actually hear us at our meetings. So that's the first thing. We are also still working on the space issue with the Office of the Ombudsman and Student Advocate. We have been in conversation with Councilmember Mendelson around this and DGS. We are identifying some possible solutions. So hope to be running the corner on that. It should not, though, delay the launch of the soft launch of the virtual resource center. So some good news and some hopefully soon to be good news from the admin committee.
Excellent. Questions for the admin committee? I'm super excited about the owl.
Oh, and if people don't know what an owl is, like people who are listening to this meeting, we are not actually getting an owl like Harry Potter style. It is a piece of equipment that we used at our most recent working session that does a better job of following who is talking during a meeting. So that you can actually hear us as opposed to using cell phones and other technology that are not built for a room of people. So yes, unfortunately, it's not we won't have pet owls, but we will have equipment that hopefully helps the public access our meetings in an efficient way.
Excellent. Thank you, Vice President Thompson. Dr. Reed, anything additional from advocacy and outreach?
You're right. We covered most of it, our big thing. But I do want to plug June 17th at 10 a.m. is our next meeting time, which is our usual meeting time. And because our discussion was so robust on the topic I previously discussed, we have all our information related to the Parent Engagement Council things. We're still working on a name to call it. But we'll be discussing that. And I think kind of the vibe of the group, it might be interesting to have see if we can get like a panel or something to go over parent engagement or something like that to kind of help us look at, there are some draft materials to look at and make sure that it's addressing the needs related to the Essa standards for parent engagement. So if that's your jam or some people that you would like for us to engage, let me know or come to our meeting.
Thank you, Dr. Reed. Questions for Dr. Reed? All right, back to Vice President Thompson for board governance.
Okay, headlines again for board governance. So I mentioned, I believe at our working session, that since we, of course, do not have an amazing budget, we are shifting some of our engagement strategies. One of which is to ask members to be the ones to have host like mini sessions. I know that Representative Wattenberg has on her calendar an engagement at the Ward 3 Education Council meeting coming up. I also am on the calendar for the Ward 7 Education Council. We do have slides and everything available. Darren, thank you, Caitlin, as always, for the slides. And thank you to Darren for walking us through like, you know, how to get it done. He is also welcome in on hand if members want support. We just ask that as the board governance committee, you let us know if you are going to meetings because we want to tag team with you. My assumption is it's kind of hard to facilitate and take notes at the same time. Also, we want to receive as much feedback as possible. So it's helpful for us to hear a different perspective. So let us know if you would like us to attend. That's all. Just you can shoot me an email or shoot me and Darren an email. That's probably the better way to do it. So we can keep track of those engagements. Finally, we will have a survey out soon. All of these things really are asking the same questions as the questions we started to ask at the fall engagement. It will all be synthesized and put into one place that will inform our first set of draft recommendations. So we're taking the approach of multiple types of engagement to reach as many people as possible.
Questions for Vice President Thompson? Vice President Thompson, I have one, and I'm sure you've said this, and it just went right through. When should we be scheduling these engagement opportunities? Like, what's a good window, start and end, that we should have in mind for that?
So start is now. We're trying to get as much done in the month of June as possible with the expectation that the survey will run June to July. We know this is not the only engagement for board governance, and we will also have a couple of focus groups in July that provide a more extended experience because we're anticipating that if you go to the 15-minute version, you probably have some more in your mind. But we wanted to get in as many civic association, ANCs, people who go on hiatus when it gets summer, as possible. And chances are we're not taking up their whole agenda with the hour-long session. So we needed a 15-minute we're a visitor version.
Great, thank you so much. Other questions for Vice President Thompson? Excellent. I'm going to turn to Alex Ju on our staff for the Education Standards Committee update.
Hi all. So in Representative Chang's absence, just wanted to let you all know that at the last committee meeting, there was a panel discussion titled Student Voice and Engagement in State Standards Review that was held. And it featured 3 panelists, a student representative from the Massachusetts Board of Education, a student representative from the Kentucky Board of Education, and then a consultant that works with the Connecticut State Education Research Center. And the discussion focused on how to incorporate and engage students in standards review processes across various states. I do want to thank our policy fellow, Giselle Miranda, for her really incredible work in organizing that as well as moderating that panel. And there's more to come there. Additionally, updates on the literacy streams of work. Alistair was accepted into the NASB Early Literacy Working Group, and he'll be working alongside, I think, a group of 10 members from maybe 9 NASB states. And again, more information to come on that when that happens. I personally met with 2 students through Dr. Sutter's American University Pro Seminar course, and they're going to be assisting us with a little bit of literacy-focused research over the summer, and so that's exciting. And then I don't believe we have any new or additional updates on the social studies standards work beyond what was shared with us by Dr. Grant at the May 18th public meeting. And so that is the update.
Thank you, Mr. Ju. Other questions for the Education Standards Committee? Okay, great. Then we're going to turn to teacher practice and school support. Dr. O'Leary?
I'd like to sort of piggyback on what Alex was talking about on the standards committee. The state board representatives from student representatives from 3 states were just unbelievable. And but they weren't as good as ours, but they were really good. We met on the 10th of May, and it was just Alistair and me. Zachary owes us a day, and we started off talking about what legislation was passed during the budget hearings, because Ward 4 was got some great news about swing space, and the Roosevelt Stay program is now going to be going to Garner-Patterson as a permanent place. And those are two things that we worked really hard on in Ward 4 to get it through the budget. And also the structured literacy training, which was passed by the council. So that was basically what Allison and I talked about before we started talking about what we're going to do. We're going to set up hopefully a round table with assistant principals who have been kind of overlooked as spokespersons and have valuable information that will help us in trying to find out about teacher retention. As you know, we do have a part of the budget that's going to, Mary Levy's going to be working on the teacher retention, and the Aussie just got through with publicizing the teacher retention figures for this past year. And I think that's available to everyone. So we'll find out what we're going to do. But we are also working on inviting someone from Tennessee to talk to us about their teacher apprenticeship program, so that we can talk more about the Grow Your Own programs in the District of Columbia. That's basically what we talked about.
Thank you, Dr. O'Leary. Yeah, the educator data report from Aussie, I would encourage all the members of the public to check it out. I have it open on my browser, hoping for a spare moment to take a look and dive deep, but getting more data on our educators is something the board has been advocating for, and Dr. O'Leary, you've been continuing to champion. So I'm glad that that's moving ahead. Questions for Dr. O'Leary? All right. External committees, reports from any of our external committees. Vice President Thompson?
Sorry, I'm lacking on the Zoom today. I still sit on the NASB Public Education Positions Committee. Just a quick update. I'm on the 3 topics we are paying attention to. 2 are particularly relevant to our work. 1 is actually educator practice and retention nationally. That's actually the subgroup I'll be working on. So I look forward to updating people as that evolves. 2, we also, I believe, have a working group on literacy. I can't be on both things, but as we do get updates, I will let you know. If you are in, a quick plug for people can, like, technically I'm the only one who gets a vote, but if people want to sit in on any of those meetings, that would be awesome. And if there are things coming out, and Darren staffs me on those, but if there are things that we should be lifting up for national conversations that we're learning from, like, our educator practice or our assessment and accountability committees, please let me know. Because those are the things that go to the full NASB delegation to establish nationally what we think should be happening or state board should be paying attention to.
Great, thank you, Vice President Thompson. The NASB Government Affairs Committee doesn't meet until next Tuesday, so I will hold my update on that for now, because I don't have anything new to report this month.
Oh,
RPT. I know how it goes.
Yeah, we voted to, I think we have our bylaws in place. It's starting to mush together, but our next, for the public, our next meeting, and I believe it's in person, or at least it's in person for us, is June 6th. And I'm sure there's a way for the public to watch us meet in person. So
awesome. Thank you, Dr. Reed. Always good to hear about the work of the RPP and how that's coming along. All right, members, we are then on to new business. Are there items of new business from members? All right, hearing none, then I'm going to, oh, sorry, I see 2. Let me pause and turn to Representative Bernstad.
Hi, I know if anyone mentioned this earlier or if student reps are supposed to mention it or what, but the application for the SAC and the student reps deadline has been extended to, I believe, June 15th. So if it wasn't mentioned, or if it was mentioned and I wasn't here, it's been extended. It's on the SBOE social media. I'm sure it's somewhere in the inboxes, but it's been extended. So please share it around.
Thank you, Representative Bernstad. We got good bookends. I got to mention it at the beginning. You're mentioning it here towards the end. If members have not yet sent it out to your constituents, please do. Just as a point of suggestion, I also sent it out to some different after school and out of school time groups that I know work with schools in Ward 6. And I've gotten back some good responses from folks. Representative Bernstad, I sent it to the DC Urban Debate League, making sure that they help publicize this to debaters. I sent it to DC Strings, making sure they help publicize it to our student musicians to make sure that we continue to recruit a fabulously diverse group of students with different interests to our student advisory committee. Vice President Thompson.
President Sutter flagged at the top of her remarks that it's been a couple of pretty hot days and we have a lot of schools having HVAC issues. I spent a good chunk of my day calling and confirming and texting and confirming which of my schools had HVAC issues, because what's in the dashboard doesn't necessarily align to what's on the ground. I'm raising this because I actually thought that we had passed some type of resolution around facilities, but I don't think we ever have, because the staff checked for me. It is something that we do give a mention to in our budget letter, priorities letter, but I just wanted to raise it as something to think about for members. I know that I've seen a lot of activity on Twitter. Unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, but I feel like that a lot of that activity is like one classroom, one place, and I had 5 schools that aren't reflected in like the Twitter activity. And so I'm encouraging people to reach out to their schools. I'm curious if people want to talk offline about just different strategies and supports that they offer to schools. But I'm just flagging that it's been a problem for me in Ward 7, and it's something to be paid attention to.
Ward 4 too.
Thank you, Vice President Thompson. I think it's an important thing for us to consider. That it falls squarely in the bucket of something we have no authority over, and yet something that we are the recipient of a lot of the outreach from constituents about, because the voice of public education, we hear about it. We hear about it from our schools. We hear about it from our neighbors and our families. So I'd love to see us think about how we say something, take a stand on this, and try to move the needle on this. Representative Wattenberg.
Yeah, just on this, one thing that has happened in the last few weeks, actually, even before the current issue with the heat, is, as some of you may know, in Ward 3, we have a high school senior from Wilson who is running for our council seat. And one thing that he has been doing, he's been very, very active on Twitter about all the different things that aren't working at Wilson. The HVAC's not working, the light's not working, the door is broken, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on it today because I know it's late, but it did occur to me that we could make a wonderful contribution if the SAC was interested in sort of having somebody from each school that had this as sort of part of what they did, to sort of regularly tweet out what the issues were so that the city knew about it and people could start creating a real document based on it. So I throw it out there so that people can think about it, and we can come back to it on another time. But I'm curious if the SAC folks would find that interesting. I mean, it's just been really a tremendous addition to the debate here with just a lot of facts every day.
Thanks, Representative Wattenberg. Looks like we got a noted from our SAC members and an interest in following up. So we'll look forward to that. Any other new business? Dr. O'Leary?
If I could send you my testimony for the last year about how, seriously, about how the buildings are in disrepair. And hopefully someone's moving on it, but we really need to, I mean, we bring it up every time we testify about how the buildings, there are some schools, even this brand new schools. I mean, Representative Wattenberg's talking about Wilson, which is a relatively old new school, but Roosevelt's HVAC system has never worked. And Cardozo was after Roosevelt, and it's got HVAC problems.
Yeah, yeah.
And Coolidge is the newest one, and it's got HVAC problems.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I understand too. We've got enormous buildings, and enormous buildings are difficult to keep evenly hot and cool, and yet we have a responsibility to educate children in these buildings. And so getting this right matters a great deal. And I think finding the right way for the board to make our own stance on this and find a way to communicate about it is important. So if folks have specific ideas, obviously Representative Wattenberg offered one up to the SAC. If we've got thoughts on a resolution or something, let's go ahead and start emailing about that so that we can figure out what might come next. I want to move us to the last important part of our meeting. As noted in our meeting announcement, the state board will now enter a closed session to discuss the process for appointment of staff under DC Official Code 2575B10. I move to close the meeting. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Dr. O'Leary. Seconded by Representative O'Leary. All in favor of closing the meeting, say aye.
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 All opposed, say nay. The ayes have it, and this meeting of the state board